It's a cold December night in 1957, and a young man receives a military draft notice calling him to serve in the United States Army. At 22 years old, he has a promising future ahead of him, and at such a young age, he's already successful. But he knows that his career will have to be put to the side, as this draft notice is not a request to serve, but an order. It may be hard to imagine, but this young man was none other than Elvis Presley, who served in the U.S. Army for nearly 3 years before being honorably discharged and continuing one of the most famous music careers in history. But what would have happened if Elvis stood up to the U.S. Army in 1957 and threw away his draft notice to continue his music career? What if you received a draft notice today and didn't answer the call to duty? In this episode of the Infographics Show, we explore the question, what happens if you dodge the draft? Let's travel back to the 1950s when the draft was still being implemented and millions of men like the King of Rock were subject to being called up. Following a few short years of peace after the end of World War II, the U.S. found itself embroiled in another international conflict, commonly referred to as the Korean War. While a passive military draft was in effect, the United States government was on edge as international threats felt closer to home thanks to nuclear weapons. This is one reason why the United States government felt it necessary to ramp up their efforts in increasing the size of the military. It's no surprise then that Congress passed the Universal Military Training and Service Act in 1951, which required all men aged 18 to 26 to register for the draft. For men that didn't even want to serve in the military in the first place, being pulled away against their will was incredibly terrifying. Can you imagine leaving home and halting your life at the demand of the US government? Even someone as famous as Elvis Presley, despite passionate protests from his fans, could not escape this requirement. As a result, according to the U.S. Justice Department, over 80,000 men attempted to dodge the draft from 1950 to 1953 during the Korean War. But it wasn't until the Vietnam War in the 60s that dodging the draft became well documented and increasingly punished. According to global researchers, over 570,000 men were classified as draft offenders by the U.S. Justice Department during the 1960s when the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular. To put that number into perspective, that's basically the entire population of Wyoming. It's important to keep in mind, though, that of those 570,000 men, only 210,000 were formally accused of dodging the draft, and of those 210,000, only 3,250 men were jailed. That means that less than 2% of accused draft dodgers were significantly punished according to these statistics. That seems like an awfully low percentage when you consider that dodging the draft is classified as a felony crime. In fact, you'd have better odds of being asked to come on down on The Price is Right. So why does it seem like the consequences of dodging the draft are so low? It turns out that there are many creative ways to dodge the draft and avoid doing the time for the crime. According to researchers, some of those men drafted to serve the U.S. military in the Vietnam War avoided service through a number of outrageous but perfectly legal means, including emigrating to Canada, purposefully failing their physicals, and even becoming missionaries. In fact, in what was possibly a regrettable interview for the Free Press, American singer Ted Nugent allegedly admitted that he stopped all personal hygiene and made sure to urinate and defecate on himself before his physical just to avoid serving in the Vietnam War. Can you imagine being the physician that had to examine him? Perhaps unsurprisingly, his stunt allegedly worked. According to Nugent in this interview, he was successfully able to defer his service. While he probably made a physician second-guess their career choices, perhaps it was for the best that Nugent didn't serve in the Vietnam War. As he's reported to have said, "The men who went should be applauded, but if I would have gone over there, I'd have been killed, or I'd have killed all the hippies in the foxholes. I would have killed everybody." It is worth noting that the facts behind this story are extremely controversial, but if true, this would definitely make for one of the most interesting draft dodging stories in U.S. history. Like Ted Nugent's stories, we'll never truly know the full extent to which men dodged the draft, but needless to say, men were highly motivated to do just about anything to avoid serving in the military or serving time in jail. Flash forward to present day, some may be surprised to note that while the draft does not exist in the United States today, young men are still required to register as if one existed or could exist in the future. Men between the ages of 18 and 25 are still required to register into what's called the Selective Service System, which is essentially a backup plan in case a draft needs to take place. And not registering can have some pretty big consequences, including lack of access to federal loans, not being able to apply for government jobs, and in some states, they even forbid you from getting a driver's license. The reality today is that dodging the draft is not the issue, but dodging the registration for the draft is, and it's a harsh reality that many young men are living with. One young man in particular, Daniel Devil Davis, found himself in a situation where he did not register for the Selective Service between the ages of 18 and 25. He was in various foster homes and prisons when he was younger and didn't even know that he had to register for the Selective Service until he came face to face with an opportunity to turn his life around. Tragically, when he finally had the opportunity to go to college, he found that he was unable to because he could not apply for a federal student loan due to his lack of registration into the Selective Service. He said, quote, "As far as the Selective Service goes, I don't feel as though I should be punished. I'm someone trying to rehabilitate myself and go to school." Davis is currently trying to build a legal case, but it's quite clear that not registering for the Selective Service has already taken a toll on his life. We imagine that some of our fans may be double-checking their Selective Service registrations right now. Beyond punishing young men for not registering into a military draft system that does not actually exist, there is significant controversy surrounding if women should have to register into the Selective Service system. As recent as February 2019, a federal judge ruled that banning women from Selective Service registration is unconstitutional. This is not a new thought, though, as even President Eisenhower was quoted in 1948 on the issue of women being drafted, saying, "I am convinced that in another war, they have got to be drafted just like men. I'm convinced of that." Will we see young women have to register for the Selective Service just like the men in our lifetime? Or could involuntary military service be abandoned altogether because of the negative impact it has on people like Daniel Devil Davis? These are questions that may have to be answered soon as global politics seemingly become more tense. The date is July 2019, and rumors of a military buildup of Chinese forces across the Strait from Taiwan begin to leak to the international press. As the 4th of July is celebrated here at home, thousands of miles away, Taiwan begins to move their command and control functions into hardened nuclear-proof underground facilities. F-16s and other strike aircraft are moved into mountain bases, and dummy missile batteries and anti-aircraft platforms are set up around the island of Taiwan. August rolls around, and by now it's clear to the world that China is indeed massing what looks like an invasion force on its side of the Taiwan Strait. Though the Chinese leader Xi Jinping reassures the world that he's only interested in a peaceful reunification of Taiwan and the mainland. The American military is put at DEFCON 3, which signals the Air Force to be ready to mobilize for a potential nuclear conflict in just 15 minutes. As September comes, the Chinese military has begun commandeering civilian ships in order to help move its 1 million man strong invasion force across the channel. The Chinese military lacks the amphibious capability to move more than a few thousand troops at a time. But in order to face 100,000 Taiwanese defenders and their 2 million reservists, the People's Liberation Army will need every available ship it can get its hands on, no matter how big or small. Across the strait, Taiwan has begun littering the only 13 beaches that an invasion force could be landed on with mines, razor wire, and other horrific surprises. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is fully mobilized by now, and the United States is at DEFCON 2. All military leave is canceled, and Marines board transports as they head for bases in Australia, Japan, and Guam. PACOM's carrier groups disperse 1,000 miles offshore from Taiwan, careful to make sure that they do not stray too deep into the net of ballistic missile coverage that China uses to threaten American naval vessels. There's no hiding China's intentions now. An invasion of Taiwan is coming, and the entire world knows it. Taiwanese troops, supplemented by a few thousand rapid response American forces, dig in for what will be the largest amphibious assault in history. The date is October 3rd, 2019. The seas between Taiwan and China are finally calm again, presenting a narrow 4-week opportunity for an amphibious assault that only reoccurs briefly one other time of the year, in May. Chinese troops are rushed to waiting transports. The lucky ones board military amphibious landing craft, while the unlucky ones must make the treacherous crossing on civilian boats with little if any protection. Overhead, hundreds of missiles fly out over the strait, slamming into radar, communications, and control nodes all over the island. Airfields are cratered. Civilian power plants are destroyed. Chinese jets scream overhead en route to strike at Taiwanese tanks and artillery pieces, shortly after followed by Chinese bombers. Yet the Taiwanese Air Force has long been redeployed to underground facilities, and American-made F-16s flown by Taiwanese pilots rise up to meet the incoming Chinese planes. 1,000 miles away, U.S. carrier battle groups are given the green light to advance to forward positions just off the Taiwan coast, bringing a significant portion of America's naval air power. They alone are more than a match for the Chinese Air Force. Yet as they steam ahead, a rain of ballistic missiles falls upon the battle groups. Anti-missile defense systems intercept many, yet others manage to slip through and deal devastating blows against American supercarriers. In moments, thousands of American sailors are dead. And in the first 5 minutes of the war, more American servicemen have died than in all conflicts combined since Vietnam. By the end of the first month of fighting, American casualties will reach Vietnam War levels, with Chinese and Taiwanese casualties many times that number. By the end of 2019, the war will officially be the bloodiest conflict since World War II. But could such a war really happen? And if it did, could you actually be drafted to fight in it? The sad answer is yes. And in fact, American military planners consider the Taiwan-China situation to be one of the several flashpoints that would lead directly to a third world war. China, for its part, has long claimed that it seeks only a peaceful reunification with the island nation. Yet, just in 2016, Xi Jinping stated, "We have the determination, the ability, and the preparedness to deal with Taiwanese independence. And if we do not deal with it, we will be overthrown." China views Taiwan's continued independence as more than the historical thorn in its side, but now rather as a direct threat to the mainland's continued communist leadership. This is because the island nation has only grown more prosperous and economically powerful over the decades, becoming the 19th largest economy in the world. Taiwan also directly employs many mainland Chinese citizens, either on the island itself or in off-site factories and offices run by Taiwanese businesses. The same cannot be said in large numbers of China's influence on Taiwan. Yet, even more dangerous than Taiwan's prosperity is what Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership fear the most: its liberal democracy. Taiwan's liberal democratic values completely undermined China's own hardline nationalistic values. While China enforces strict censorship, Taiwan espouses the same liberal values that America does, and mainland Chinese have begun to take notice. Pro-democracy demonstrations continue to grow within China, and as Chinese citizens spend more time abroad both in Taiwan and Europe and America, they are starting to bring democratic values back home with them. For China, Taiwan's continued independence is a deathly threat that must one day be eliminated, and increasingly, it looks like plans to eliminate Taiwan's independence are to do so by force. Yet, if China were to launch a war against Taiwan, currently one of the likeliest conflicts that the US actively prepares for, then America would be treaty-bound to defend the island democracy. This would pit the two largest economies and military powers in the world against each other. And while the US would inevitably come out slightly ahead of China, casualties on both sides would be staggering. To this end, America would immediately need to boost its active military forces. The first step in bolstering American forces would be an immediate call-up of all reservists. With 860,000 reservists, any draft notices would likely not come for a while. Yet, depending on the scale of the war and America's objectives, a draft may ultimately be inevitable. Currently, America has two objectives to achieve in any conflict with China. The first being the complete destruction of its air and naval forces, and the second being the toppling of its communist government. The total destruction of all Chinese naval and air forces are a non-negotiable objective, meaning that no matter how the war went, unless it somehow went extremely poorly for the US, there would be no negotiations for a ceasefire until this objective was met. The US would direct all of its efforts and resources at ensuring that no Chinese naval or air forces survive the conflict. And the reasoning is quite simple. China cannot hope to fight a second war if its Navy and Air Force is destroyed, and a lengthy rearmament period would take a decade or more, giving ample opportunity for the US and allies to rearm themselves. The removal of China's communist government is an ancillary objective, which would be carried out via precision strikes, covert operations, and psychological operations aimed at the Chinese citizenry. Given that a purely military removal of China's government would require a full-scale land invasion, the US is happy to wage a war and not meet this objective, or leave it in the hands of a civilian population riled up by aggressive psychological operations. In the first scenario, it's unlikely that a draft would be instigated by the US government, given the US's advantages in naval and air forces both. Though both the American Navy and Air Force would suffer significant losses in the effort, China would indubitably face the complete annihilation of its own Navy and Air Force to the Americans and their allies. In this case, reservists would likely be enough to bring American combat strength back to manageable levels, and a draft would be highly unlikely. Yet, if the scope of the conflict expanded for any reason, and a direct removal of China's communist government was the only road to peace, an American draft would be a necessity. With over 2 million active duty forces in the Chinese military, the US and its allies would need to bolster their own numbers significantly to even attempt an invasion of China. All male American citizens and immigrant non-citizens between the ages of 18 and 25 are required by law to register in the Selective Service System. In 2010, the SSS had over 16 million young American men on file, yet the US has a total fit-for-service manpower pool of over 111 million. With an increasingly bloody conflict against China, the SSS would without a doubt be activated, and full-rate conscription would begin for the first time since Vietnam. War with China is not likely, and yet it is considered the most realistic and probable flashpoint for the world's next major war. While the world has not seen any major powers go to war since the end of World War II, and it will hopefully not see them do so ever again, the reality is that several of any possible diplomatic missteps in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait could lead to an unavoidable conflict between the US and China. And with the life of the Chinese Communist Party likely dependent on forcing Taiwan back into the fold and crushing the island's democratic government, the US may be headed straight for another military draft sooner than any of us could have hoped for. Every day, Russia threatens to retaliate against NATO for supplying Ukraine. China has all but cut off diplomatic ties with the US over Taiwan, and its military has surrounded the island multiple times for military drills. The world seems to be teetering closer than ever to a third world war. But what if it really happened? Could you be drafted to fight in this future conflict? First, what is the draft, and are you even eligible for one? For most of human history, militaries were staffed by part-time soldiers, typically peasants, who were drafted into service for fighting in between the planting and harvesting seasons. This was by design, and most war was limited to this time because without farm workers to plant and harvest crops, a nation would starve. At the very least, its economy would suffer greatly. The expansion of war into a year-round affair didn't really happen until political states grew wealthy enough to be able to afford the offsetting of this cost via importing food from other places. Even then, if you had a very specific and valuable specialization, such as blacksmithing, you would almost certainly not be drafted except in extreme emergencies. Blacksmiths and other specializations were too rare and valuable to the state to be worth either risking on the front lines or having their work disrupted on a months or years-long campaign. Even as nations became economically large enough to offset the cost of losing a significant amount of their workforce, most warriors were still draftees rather than professional soldiers. This was due to the sheer cost of training and equipping a full-time force. We tend to think of ancient economies in terms similar to our own, but the truth is that the wealth of even the greatest ancient empires paled in comparison to that of a modest nation today. Ancient Rome, probably one of the richest empires in the ancient world, only had a GDP per capita of about 570 modern dollars. Today, Burundi is the world's poorest nation and still has a GDP per capita of $1,711, making the average Burundian 3 times wealthier than the average Roman. What that means was that for ancient empires, maintaining a professional volunteer force was a costly affair, and many simply couldn't afford it. Rome itself could only afford to abandon conscription during the imperial period, when the vast majority of its forces were professional volunteers serving for as many as 40 years. Not only was the cost of paying, training, and equipping a soldier high, but for many empires, removing thousands or tens of thousands of military-aged men from the economy permanently was simply impossible. After all, each soldier was another member of society that wouldn't contribute to the economy. Instead, armies resorted largely to conscription in preparation for and during war, and the hiring of mercenaries, which had a much higher upfront cost but were still cheaper than raising an army from scratch. Mercenaries were, for most of human history, the bulwark of many armies, and it wasn't until the world entered into Westphalian nation-state age that mercenaries began to go out of style, being replaced by full-time professional armies funded and maintained by the state. Today, most nations have adopted the model of a professional military, though many, such as Russia, still maintain conscription to make up a significant amount of their military force. Even nations such as the United States of America, which has a full volunteer military, are fully prepared to institute a draft in case of a national emergency. Today, the United States maintains a selective service system, an independent agency tasked with sorting out the logistics of enacting a national draft. The SSS requires all male U.S. citizens and immigrant non-citizens between the ages of 18 and 25 to be registered within 30 days of their 18th birthday. For the next 7 years, those registered must also notify the SSS of any changes to their public record, such as a change of address. The agency was established by the Selective Service Act of 1917 by President Woodrow Wilson after the U.S. Army failed to meet its target of expanding its forces to 1 million men after the declaration of war on Germany by the U.S. Now the president had the power to conscript men between the ages of 21 to 30 for a period of 12 months, and selectees were placed in one of 5 classifications. Men in Class 1 were the first to be drafted and would typically consist of healthy bachelor men. Men in lower classes would be drafted last, and deferments existed for medical conditions, especially for men who were fathers or husbands. A year later, the age limit was increased to 45 as the war dragged on, and the draft would finally be ended in 1920, a few years after Germany's surrender. There's a common myth that the U.S. was caught completely unprepared for the Second World War, but this is far from true. In fact, despite having a strong isolationist streak, the United States was preparing for the eventuality that it would once more be dragged into Europe's war, and thus, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 became the first peacetime conscription in U.S. history. The act required all men between the ages of 18 and 64 to register with the Selective Service, and originally it conscripted all men between the ages of 21 and 35 for a service of at least 12 months, with some exemptions, of course. As the war in Europe intensified and Japan became increasingly antagonistic, the service period was extended to 18 months and the age bracket was increased 18 to 37. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the service length of the draft was increased to last as long as the war lasted, plus an additional 6 months in reserve. This draft would be noticeable, however, for raising the issue of drafting women for the first time in U.S. history. In 1945, President Roosevelt requested the draft be expanded to include the drafting of female nurses, as there was a critical shortage at the time. This debate soon spread to the matter of drafting all women, period, though it soon ended in the House of Representatives. Instead, a modified bill drafting only female nurses was passed by the House but defeated in the Senate. The attention brought to the issue, however, generated a surge of volunteers, helping fill a critical shortage. The modern Selective Service Act has its origins in 1948 and would create a permanent national system to enable the rapid mobilization of the U.S. for war. All men 18 or older had to register with the Selective Service, and all men between the ages of 18 and 25 were eligible to be drafted for a minimum requirement of 21 months. This would be followed by 12 consecutive months of active service or 36 consecutive months of service in the reserves, with a maximum service amount of 5 years. However, due to deep budgetary cuts to the U.S. military after World War II, only 100,000 men were conscripted in 1948. But in 1950, with the launch of the Korean War, the draft was once more instituted. The Korean War expanded active duty service time from 21 months to 24 months and set the minimum amount of military service at 8 instead of 5 years. Students going to college or in a full-time training program could request an exemption, and these were more likely to be given to those studying economic or war industry critical fields such as engineering. There was an attempt to include a universal military training clause which would have made all men obligated to perform 12 months of military service and training, similar to how many European militaries operate even today, but that clause was never passed. During the Vietnam War, it looked more and more probable the conflict would expand to one against the Soviet Union. The Military Selective Service Act of 1967 expanded the age of conscription to the ages of 18 to 55. President John F. Kennedy, however, signed Executive Order 11-119, which granted an exemption from the draft for married men between the ages of 19 and 26. However, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, did away with that exemption for married men who had no children. Only married men with children or other dependents, or men married before the executive order went into effect, remained exempt. President Ronald Reagan would finally revoke both executive orders in 1986. In 1969, President Richard Nixon tried to address the growing disapproval of the draft by switching to a lottery-based selection system. The first draft lottery was held on the 1st of December 1969 for all registrants born between January 1944 and December 1950. 2 more lotteries would be held, the second on July 1st, 1970, and the third August 5th, 1971. This would also be the year that the Military Selective Service Act was amended to more closely resemble our modern system, with registration being compulsory for all men within 30 days of their 18th birthday. This new act would continue to classify registrants into different categories. Those registered 1A were eligible for general military service. 1AO would be for conscientious objectors, who for ethical or religious reasons were only available for non-combatant military service, such as medics and logistics. 1O classified conscientious objectors eligible eligible for alternate community service and not for service directly in a war zone itself. With a stronger economy and larger population pool, deferments for students were ended altogether, except for divinity students who received a 2D selective service classification. Men who had completed their military service and thus not eligible to be redrafted were classified as 4A. In 1975, President Gerald R. Ford, whose son had failed to register for the draft, formally ended the compulsory registration for men between the ages of 18 to 25. However, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter retroactively re-established the selective service requirement for all male citizens aged 18 to 26. In the modern age, attempts to dismantle the selective service system in 2016 failed to pass the U.S. House of Representatives. Later that year, a similar bill would also fail to gain traction in the U.S. Senate. However, the issue of drafting women was raised by the House Armed Services Committee, who voted to add an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017 that would extend the authority for draft registration to women. The Senate Armed Services Committee had also voted to add a similar provision. Had either passed, it would have granted the president the authority but not the requirement to order young women to also register for the selective service system. In their place, a provision was enacted into law in December of 2016 that set up a commission to study and make recommendations on the drafting, draft registration, general registration, and the streamlining of procedures to include women with selective skills such as medical, dental, nursing, language skills, cyber skills, and STEM skills for which the nation had a critical need. The commission would also include recommendations on drafting of individuals to critically needed fields without regard to age, potentially removing the cap on how old one could be to still be drafted. What we are left with today is a system where all men between the ages of 18 to 25 must register for the selective service system within 30 days of their 18th birthday. This also includes certain categories of non-U.S. citizens such as permanent residents, refugees, asylum seekers, and illegal immigrants. Previous options to indicate that one is a conscientious objector no longer exist, but individuals can still make that claim upon being actually drafted. However, even though women are not currently eligible for a national draft, it's almost certain that an amendment would quickly be passed in wartime to include the drafting of women. This is largely because while women are still only allowed in a handful of combat arms fields, modern war has become a high-tech affair, and millions of well-qualified women with technical skills would be required to wage a modern conflict against a near-peer opponent, such as Russia or China. So, would you be drafted to fight in World War III? The odds are you will, though it very much depends on the nature of the conflict. Currently, the only realistic conflict, which could be termed World War III, would be one involving the United States and its allies against China and/or Russia. However, the world is not as it was in the 40s, and even such a conflict would not truly be global. For starters, Russia lacks the capability to prosecute a war far from its own borders. After taking staggering losses in Ukraine, the nation simply doesn't have the hardware to conduct a war deeper into Europe. The key here is hardware, however, as the nation still has vast amounts of military-age manpower it could call upon. Yet, facing NATO's armies on foot without combat vehicles would be an act of national suicide. And this is where Russia's losses hurt the most. Manpower losses are easily replaced for a nation as large as Russia, but modern, expensive equipment is much more difficult to replace, especially when your nation is under severe sanctions. As it stands, sanctions against Russia will make it all but impossible for it to fully replenish its combat losses of hardware with modern equivalents, though the nation is using its intelligence agencies to set up shell companies in an attempt to buy badly needed, sanctioned high-tech components such as microchips. With a resurgence in European defense spending and Russia stuck in a quagmire consuming weapons and equipment at an alarming rate, it's likely NATO's armies can defeat Russia on the battlefield without calling for a general draft, at least for its Western members. Members on the Eastern Front, especially those bordering Russia, might need to call upon a draft to quickly bolster their numbers before Western NATO troops can arrive in force. China's military is in much better shape to fight a large war. However, a conflict with China is also extremely unlikely to require a full draft in the conventional sense. That's because war with China will be an affair carried out on the sea and in the air, with very little if any action by ground forces of the US and its allies. The greatest land campaign that might be waged by US and allies would be a liberation of Taiwan. But even this would only take place after the Chinese Navy and Air Force has largely been destroyed, leaving Chinese forces in Taiwan at the mercy of Allied air power. It's likely that current Allied ground forces are sufficient for the task, especially as the Chinese would be facing millions of Taiwanese draftees already. With the war limited to the air and sea, a general draft is almost certainly unlikely in case of a war with China. Since China can do little to threaten the US mainland, a war would need to be waged on its own backyard. And with U.S. forces easily cutting off the nation from badly needed oil imports by the sea, destroying the Kamchatka oil pipeline from Russia through cruise missile strikes, China would be unable to prosecute a large-scale war for very long before its economy completely collapsed. The truth is that the United States does not have a rival anywhere in the world that can generate the amount of combat power it can. And no force exists today that can wage a war against the NATO alliance. This is nothing like the strategic picture of the 1910s and the 1930s when the world was filled with rival powers of nearly equal strength. What is likely, however, is a national service draft modified to bring individuals into badly needed high-tech manufacturing sectors. As the first large-scale modern war, the Ukrainian war has shown the West how frighteningly fast reserves of smart weapon systems are used up. If the U.S. was to wage a high-intensity conflict against China and Russia simultaneously, stockpiles of smart weapons might only last a matter of months, necessitating a massive rearmament effort that the U.S. is currently very unprepared for. If combat losses then extend to weapon systems themselves, the U.S. is in an even worse position to replenish said losses, given how very small its defense manufacturing capability has become in recent decades. Simply put, the United States is not in a position at the moment to replenish high-rate losses in advanced weapon systems such as submarines, aircrafts, and Abrams tanks. Individuals with the needed skills would almost certainly be drafted to expand this manufacturing capability, and their service would even extend after the war was over, as the U.S. quickly attempts to rearm itself. In fact, by the time that defense manufacturing was expanded to meet the rate of combat attrition, it's almost certain the war would be over anyway. Though it would be critical to quickly rearm and prevent another state from taking advantage of current U.S. weaknesses to launch a new war elsewhere. Conscription, or the draft as it's more commonly known, has been around for thousands of years. The practice has transcended all time, societal, and cultural boundaries as a common method of raising manpower for military service when volunteers were not enough to fill out the ranks. After all, the prospect of harsh conditions, disease, and death in battle is not a great incentive to most people. This was especially so for wars before the 21st century, where advances in technology and sanitary conditions for troops in the battlefield were nowhere near the quality they are today. The draft itself has its roots all the way back in the Code of Hammurabi, which was the first written legal code in the world hailing from ancient Mesopotamia. Here, men were obligated to perform yearly military service at the discretion of their rulers for most of their lives. The practice continued on through the Middle Ages, where landed serfs, as a requirement for owning property, were forced to provide at least one son to feudal armies. Despite these earlier conscription examples, the idea of avoiding the draft and the controversy surrounding it was not subject for public debate until the Napoleonic Wars. Called a levée en masse, this was the first general draft in modern history. All French citizens were required to register, and it was this general draft that created the baseline for drafts to come. All citizens were required to register by birth year, and they would be called up once they reached the age of 21. Wealthier French citizens could afford to purchase an exemption and thereby avoid military service. The idea of exempting oneself to military service by paying the government a rather large sum of money infuriated most people who saw the conflict as a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The sentiment was one of the main reasons for early draft dodgers throughout the 19th century. During this time, there was not a whole lot one could do to avoid the draft if one was called up. There was no robust medical system like there is in today's military, where pre-existing conditions could get you exempted from service. Nor was there what's called a conscientious objector status for those opposed to war on moral or religious grounds. It was difficult to avoid the draft in the 19th century America merely by running away, since most people around this time were small yeoman farmers. Leaving their families and property behind without a penny to their name and going to another country was an unlikely scenario. Rather, most of those opposed to the draft would rather desert from the military after being forced into it. Doing so had a few obvious benefits. They could procure arms for themselves for personal defense, have a few extra dollars in their pocket, and most importantly, avoid the shame of being considered a draft dodger. After joining, whether it was a Union or Confederate army, they could reasonably justify their desertion to others by stating that the government had not upheld its bargain of the contractual obligation of their enlistment. Though desertion would forfeit a pension, the stigma from avoiding the draft could be avoided, which was of greater immediate concern to those forced to join the army. The vast majority of the Confederate Army and a large portion of the Union Army were all drafted into the service, so there were plenty of people who did not want to be there. Those who deserted from both sides could face a possible death sentence if apprehended again. Though thousands of deserters were caught and death sentences issued, very few were carried out. Several hundred Union soldiers and probably a similar number of Confederate ones were shot for this crime. It is important to mention that the vast majority of those executed for desertion were notorious bounty jumpers. It was common in the North to offer enlistment bonuses called bounties of up to $300, which was a tremendous sum at the time. It was rather common for some of these professional bounty jumpers to simply enlist, desert, and then enlist again in another unit. While not draft dodging per se, it was a way for criminally minded people to avoid active service and make a handsome profit at the same time. It was these men that were most often executed for this crime, but not all. There was a famous case coming from Stonewall Jackson's army where a private left the army to care for his ailing mother. He claimed that he did not want to continue serving for this reason alone. After being apprehended, Stonewall Jackson did not believe him and had the private executed anyway. Not all draft resistors took a passive stance, however. A Confederate private by the name of Newt Knight became disillusioned with the war. He was one of the many Confederates who had remained a staunch Unionist and was morally opposed to slavery. After serving for over a year in the Army, he deserted and went back home to his farm in Jones County, Mississippi. Here, he formed an independent company of armed deserters, runaway slaves, and those who refused to fight for the Confederacy into a guerrilla movement. Knight's group of guerrillas attacked and harassed many of the dreaded tax collectors who were robbing Southern homes of all their food and livestock. He even skirmished with regular Confederate troops over a dozen times. Confederate authorities were powerless to force the draft dodgers to subdue and sent in massive reinforcements to crush the rebellion. The Confederate Army managed to capture and execute 10 of Knight's men, but the majority of the band slipped away into the wilderness. They were able to outlast the Confederates until the end of the war. The area where Newt and his men operated henceforth became known in the history books as the Free State of Jones. While armed resistance and being forced to fight was certainly rare, resistance to being drafted to fight for a cause one did not believe in continued on for years to come. Some of the most notable examples of this come from the First World War. In Great Britain, the issue of the draft was highly contentious, and many, after seeing the great suffering on a massive scale, were not interested in fighting a politically motivated war. This staunch group of pacifists and religious objectors solidified the theory of conscientious objection. Conscientious objection is the opposition to war on moral or religious grounds that serving in the military would violate one's personal beliefs. In Britain, the military authorities for the first time in history recognized this as a valid exemption to service and began hearing cases of those who wanted to apply for such status. However, being awarded it was incredibly difficult, and of the tens of thousands of cases heard, only a select handful were awarded this coveted status. For the rest of those who claimed conscientious objector status but were turned down, an alternative method of service was offered. This was known as the Non-Combatant Corps, also known as the No Courage Corps by a deriding public. That would allow these men to serve in auxiliary roles in supply and in hospitals for the Army. But one group of men, known as the Richmond 16, refused to do even this service. The Richmond 16 were actually a group of 44 men from different NCC barracks around Great Britain who refused to do service. The Richmond 16 were just the first ones to be imprisoned for their insubordination. After trying to convince them to work for the Army and their continued refusal, the Army gave them two choices: work or die. The British Army did face a dilemma here in that they could not sentence the men to death in Great Britain since the crime of insubordination was not punishable by death. Therefore, the Army came up with a plan to send all 44 men to an area near the front in France where they could come under enemy fire. If they refused to wear a uniform and work here, they could be charged with cowardice before the enemy, which would earn them a death sentence. The Richmond 16 were staunch in their beliefs, and so they were sent to France. They refused even their last opportunity to cave in, despite authorities attempting to lie, stating others had already gave in to service. Within the next week, all 42 men were sentenced to be shot, but swift action from the Prime Minister saved their lives. Instead, the Richmond 16 were all given 10-year prison terms, but released in 1919. Great Britain was not alone in its ill treatment of those who did not want to serve. Even tiny New Zealand wanted every available man to fight at the front. As part of the Commonwealth, New Zealand was committed entirely to World War I, and beginning in 1915 instituted a draft of all available men for military service. Archibald Baxter was one of about 100 conscientious objectors who did not want to serve. All 100 of these men were imprisoned instead. By the summer of 1917, with the end of the war nowhere in sight and casualties mounting, it was decided that even these men would be sent to the front. Against their wishes, Baxter and 13 others were forced into troopship, locked into solitary confinement, and sent to France. Along the way, their guards humiliated them and stripped them of their clothes for refusing to wear uniforms. They were often beaten and had ice-cold water thrown on them. After arriving in France, the men were continually subjected to torture, beatings, and being forced to hold heavy weights over their heads for long periods of time paled in comparison to their worst punishment, Field Punishment Number 1. Field Punishment Number 1 entailed tying Baxter and others to a pole within the camp for hours at a time. No matter if it was raining or snowing, they would be tied to it out in the open. Their camp was well within range of German artillery, and even with shell fire coming in, they would not be taken down. After months of this torture, only Baxter and one other man held out against serving. It was then that the New Zealand authorities decided to literally tie wire around the men and drag them to the front. Baxter reports that Mark Briggs, his only remaining compatriot, was forced headfirst into a shell crater, and then a sadistic sergeant forced a handful of mud into his mouth to increase his suffering. Despite all the abuse the two men endured, they never wavered in their beliefs. Baxter went home in April of 1918, while Briggs did not go back until 1919. Upon arrival, Baxter was seen as a national hero by many for never wavering in his beliefs, and has become an icon for pacifism in New Zealand and around the world. The cruel punishments meted out to those who refused to serve in a nation's draft continued well past the First World War. During the Second War, numerous countries executed those who did not want to participate in the conflict. Some of the most famous cases came out of Nazi Germany, where men like Franz Jägerstätter, who along with dozens of other pacifists were beheaded by the Nazis for refusing to fight for them. Even after World War II and up until the present day, numerous countries enacted laws that made avoiding the draft a felony offense. During the Vietnam War, tens of thousands of young American men were prosecuted and over 4,000 imprisoned for refusing to fight. In Eastern Europe during the Cold War, the vast majority of other countries' militaries were filled with draftees, and their governments often sentenced those who refused to serve to lengthy prison terms. Even up to this day, draft dodgers face discrimination and criminal prosecution in most countries that have mandatory military service. In Russia, for example, those who do not serve cannot work in public sector jobs for 10 years. In Colombia, those who do not serve or have the money to pay for a veteran ID card on the black market face limited job prospects without one. Countries like North Korea are said to routinely execute anyone who does not want to join the military, and even those who have valid exemptions for medical reasons are still considered second-class citizens. Avoiding the draft has only been a real option for the past several hundred years. During this time, people have avoided it for a variety of reasons, but the most common one is for deep-seated religious beliefs. Governments around the world have reluctantly accepted this line of reasoning and begrudgingly let limited numbers avoid service for this reason. But for most people, simply refusing to fight is the only way to guarantee their personal survival. In these cases, history has shown time and again that governments will go to extreme measures to force people to serve when they do not want to, in order to set an example for others. How effective these measures have been at preventing further dissent is a matter of debate. But what is certain is that those who do not want to fight for a cause they do not believe in face social stigma, limited job prospects, and stiff punishments. You might be aware that the U.S. draft for the Vietnam War didn't target everyone in the U.S. fairly. Those with influence or connections could either avoid it entirely or put themselves in positions far away from the brutal fighting in the tropical jungles of the communist nation. That's not very surprising. Power and influence have swayed people and decisions throughout history. What is surprising, though, is that some people seem to be disproportionately targeted by the draft. Before we get into the draft, let's have a quick look at how and why this conflict started by wandering through the streets of modern-day Vietnam. Bullet holes pockmark the walls of the palace. In the sky above, birds chirp, blissfully unaware. Walking through the Hue Imperial City in Vietnam today, you can't help but feel the heaviness of the country's history. At the height of the Nguyen dynasty, Hue had been the capital city for over 100 years. Within the walls of the historical city are palaces that once were homes to the imperial family. As you walk along the walls of the once ornate city, past gardens and shrines, you can imagine people sitting in the sun, smiling. But as you look closer at the walls that you're walking past, you can't help but see the bullet holes, hundreds, thousands of them. You can trace the lines of automatic machine guns sweeping from right to left wildly. UNESCO declared the city a World Heritage Site in 1993 because of its profound history and the stark symbolism that it provides for the Vietnam War. 8,500 miles away, the United States of America does not have any physical bullet holes to point to from the war. There were no World Heritage Sites or historic battlegrounds from the Vietnam War. The country was not torn apart in an ideological war inflamed by international superpowers. Their home was not bathed in liquid fire that clung to their skin. For many, the conflict is a distant memory or something to sit through in history class. But for those who fought, those who were there, those same bullet holes are present throughout their lives. And for one group of U.S. soldiers, there are disproportionate rates of trauma, poverty, injury, homelessness, and death. One group of soldiers whose country truly failed them, who were shipped off to a war they should have never been allowed to see. The men who served under Project 100,000. What the West calls the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese call the American War, or to give it its full title, the war against the Americans to save the nation. The conflict was raging before U.S. troops set foot on Vietnamese soil and continued after their eventual withdrawal. It was the second of the Indochina Wars and one of the largest proxy wars to take place as part of the Cold War. Still with us? Let's define all those things a little bit better with some of the backstory of the region. It all started with the French Jesuit missionaries arriving in the 17th century, looking to spread Catholicism to all corners of the world. The French found surprising success in Vietnam. Their influence grew steadily over the next couple hundred years, spurring trade and diplomatic relations between France and Vietnam. It wasn't just modern-day Vietnam, though. The region known as Indochina also comprised Cambodia, Laos, the Chinese territory of Guangzhou, and the Vietnamese regions of Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochin China in the south. The region turned against the Catholics over time and started to persecute and expel the missionaries from its shores. France used this as an opportunity to invade and annex Indochina in 1858. It was a long, drawn-out conflict that ended 4 years later in 1862 with the signing of the Treaty of Saigon. Catholicism was legalized again, and the French proceeded to take more and more land over the course of the next few decades until they had control of all the regions we listed earlier. But the French stronghold could only last so long. 100 years later, and on the other side of the world, Nazi Germany invaded France and took control of the nation in just 6 weeks. The war was also raging in Asia, and Japan successfully invaded and took Indochina away from the French. This conflict was even shorter, lasting just 4 days from the 22nd of September 1940 to the 26th. The French remained there but were under the control of the Japanese, who used the region as a key strategic launching point for their military against China. This period saw waves of death sweeping through the country. Poor organization from the French officials and a number of natural disasters led to severe famines that are estimated to have killed up to 1 million Vietnamese between 1944 and 1945. The scales of power looked to be in danger of tipping back quickly, though, as France was liberated from Germany in 1945 and the Nazis were in full retreat in Europe. Japan acted swiftly, ousting the remaining French from the country and establishing Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as independent states within Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This again was a dark period in Vietnamese history. More Vietnamese women were forced to become so-called comfort women for the Japanese soldiers in the region. This was true all across Asia, with comfort women stations also in China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, North Korea, and South Korea. The Japanese took Vietnamese rice in enormous quantities, refusing to pay for any of it. Along the Red River Delta in the north of Vietnam, this directly led to the starvation and deaths of between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese. This death and destruction was the birthplace of Vietnamese resistance. A revolutionary known as Ho Chi Minh rose up and formed a league for the independence of Vietnam, also known as the Viet Minh. Japan's stranglehold on Asia did not last. With their defeat in World War II, they left Vietnam, giving Ho Chi Minh communism. Kennedy believed that if one of these countries fell into Soviet control, it would cascade throughout the whole region, making Asia a stronghold for the communist regime and weakening the US's global influence significantly. They couldn't let this happen, and things only got more tense the following couple of years. A coup in South Vietnam caught Siem off guard, and he was killed by a resistance group backed by the CIA. Soon after, Kennedy was assassinated in the US. Both countries, already in precarious positions, were suddenly under new leadership. Lyndon B. Johnson took on the US presidency and took decisive action. He would drastically increase economic and military support in South Vietnam to rid them of the communist threat once and for all. Planes, attack boats, and weapons all steadily started to stream across the ocean. But there was one key promise that Johnson made. He would not put US troops on Vietnamese soil. There was an election coming up and he didn't want to lose votes after all. In 1964, a North Vietnamese boat fired at a US ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was all Johnson needed. He took the event to Congress and managed to persuade them to grant him greater military powers without having to officially declare war. He launched aerial bombing runs, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The US was walking a tightrope with this one. They didn't set many clear objectives for Operation Rolling Thunder, but instead designed it to be a display of might and intent. They wanted to intimidate and force back Ho Chi Minh's communist forces and boost South Vietnamese morale with their impressive firepower. But they didn't want to attack too hard or do too much damage. If North Vietnam looked close to collapse, they would run the risk of China or the USSR stepping in which could be a catalyst for another world war and then quickly escalate to the launch of nuclear warheads. Did it work? No. The Viet Cong did not relent. They continued to appear everywhere, fighting with greater resolve than before. The US and South Vietnam were making little progress, so in March 1965, With the support of the American people, Johnson broke his promise and sent U.S. troops to Vietnam. The initial force that arrived there totaled around 190,000 personnel. The following year, he sent across a further 400,000. What ensued was a long and harrowing war littered with war crimes, chemical weapons, propaganda, and countless casualties, which begs the question, where was the U.S. getting all of its troops? The United States military, throughout 6 different wars, had used what was called a draft system. They required all men over the age of 18 to register for the selective service. In times of war, when they need to bolster troop numbers, the U.S. government will send out letters to these men telling them to enlist in the military unless they have a reasonable exemption. Throughout the years, these exemptions have been things like having wives and children, which led to a huge surge of young Americans rushing to the altar at the outbreak of the Vietnam War. Draft evasion was widespread. While the American public at that stage was not strongly opposed to the Vietnam War, many had no desire to go over and fight themselves. To jump ahead of the curve, a lot of young men enrolled in branches that would not see any combat. The Coast Guard, for example, saw a huge boom in volunteers early on. This came back to bite them as over 15,000 of the Coast Guard ended up being sent to Vietnam by the end of the war anyway. Between 60,000 and 100,000 men fled to Canada or Sweden to avoid being called up for service. For others, college education meant they could be given more senior positions or technical roles away from the front line. This led to a poverty line in the U.S. forces, as the frontline soldiers were on average poorer and less educated. This applied double to the rich and famous, who had a good deal of influence over where they could be stationed. Some of the high-profile celebrities who dodged the draft were Ted Nugent, who took drugs and urinated on himself before his physical examination to purposefully fail, and Chevy Chase, who has admitted that he lied to his interviewers about experiencing homosexual urges, which precluded men from joining the military at the time. The biggest way that most people avoided the draft, however, was by failing the medical. There were certain basic health requirements that draftees needed to meet in order to serve in the armed forces, and not before long the American public had found all the loopholes. Defective feet are a particularly famous one, recently brought back into the public discourse, as that was Donald Trump's excuse for not serving. Buried in the medical exam was one category in particular, one that was designed to protect vulnerable people from being shipped off to war: the IQ test. Following the Second World War, a threshold had been added to the criteria for fit and able soldiers. They needed to have an IQ above 80. Below that, people were often on the borderline of having mental disabilities. In a war zone, this would put them at significantly higher risk than their peers. They might suffer from impaired decision-making, slower reaction times, and difficulty processing complex tasks quickly. There was a reason that threshold existed. But in 1966, the Vietnam War looked set to drag on, with potentially hundreds of thousands of soldiers being shipped across year after year. Lyndon B. Johnson was looking for fresh ideas to bolster his numbers. That was when his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara proposed Project 100,000. The plan was simple. They would lower the IQ threshold and loosen the rules around physical conditions. It would open up the draft to hundreds of thousands of new Americans who could fill up the basic frontline roles that the rest of the country were doing their best to avoid. It was McNamara's belief that he could raise these men's intelligence by training them up for war. He was a big proponent of advanced technology and saw the potential of videotapes as an educational tool. He thought that by playing a number of educational tapes to these low IQ soldiers, it could result in their intelligence being bolstered. It slotted in perfectly to Johnson's domestic policy as well. He declared a war on poverty. It was his goal to raise the education and living standards of the poorest and most disadvantaged Americans during his time in office. A big way of boosting these stats was getting the poor into work. This was a surefire way to get that done. People with low intelligence who were struggling to get into the workforce would be employed by the military, trained up on a new set of skills during their service, and returned to America as productive members of society. He put his plan into action, forming the New Standards Men. These soldiers were kept anonymous and distributed throughout all branches of the armed forces to pad out the numbers. They'd all scored in Category 4 of the military tests, meaning they'd scored between 10% and 30%. Soldiers with scores as low as 10% were now being shipped to Vietnam. A new nickname for the New Standards Men quickly spread through the ranks. They were looked down upon and scorned with the name Moron Corps. Not only were mentally disabled soldiers recruited through this program, but soldiers with physical disabilities too, and yet they received no special training. They were put through the exact same basic training as every other recruit, and no additional support was provided. It's still not known how many soldiers were sent to Vietnam through this program, but it's estimated between 320,000 and 354,000 men. The Army received the lion's share of these recruits, getting over 70% of them. There were low-skilled positions readily available in the Army, and due to experiencing the highest mortality rate of all the armed forces branches in Vietnam, they needed the extra numbers on the front line. And the front line for Vietnam was about as horrific as any in history. The U.S. designated areas known as free fire zones. In these places, supposedly all civilians had been given ample time and notice to evacuate, so the only people remaining there would be Viet Cong militants. They could be shot on sight. Perhaps the thing that characterized the Vietnam patriotic and treasonous. Nixon decided to roll back some of the U.S. troops in favor of a mostly aerial assault and what he called Vietnamization. Word reached the U.S. of the My Lai massacre. A village of 400 civilians had been slaughtered by U.S. troops. And still, the war rumbled on. In 1970, the U.S. and South Vietnam invaded Cambodia and Laos in breach of international law. Another wave of protests, even more incensed than before, broke out across the U.S. At Kent State University in Ohio, 4 students were shot dead. At Jackson State University in Mississippi, another 2 were killed. Another 2 years of fighting followed that. North Vietnam drafted a peace deal, but Saigon in the South rejected it. Nixon authorized a fresh wave of aerial bombings north of the border, known as the Christmas bombings. Still more bloodshed. It was only in January 1973 that a peace deal was agreed upon between the U.S. and North Vietnam, but that still didn't stop the fighting. Only once Saigon was captured by the North Vietnamese forces and renamed Ho Chi Minh City did the conflict eventually come to an end. Vietnam became a communist nation. The U.S. had failed. 20 years of war had left Vietnam scarred almost beyond recognition. 2 million Vietnamese had been killed, a further 3 million were wounded, and then 12 million on top of that had become refugees. Napalm scorched the jungles. Entire villages were razed to the ground. Exhausted, traumatized, disenfranchised, the U.S. troops returned home. 58,200 of them had died. The rest were scorned by both sides of the protests. The anti-war side saw them as war criminals, and the pro-war side saw them as an army that had failed to win against a smaller, weaker communist country. Many of the soldiers had deserted or refused to fight toward the end and were branded as cowards on their return home. Long-term exposure to herbicides like Agent Orange that had been dumped in copious amounts on the Vietnam landscape left permanent and serious health consequences. More than 300,000 of them were wounded, with many losing limbs. These soldiers were returning home with unprecedented rates of PTSD. The U.S. military had made use of psychoactive drugs commonplace during the war, handing out amphetamines to soldiers regularly with little regulation. It was supposed to heighten their responses and give them the alertness needed for long-range reconnaissance missions. But what it had actually done was create a frenzied storm in many of the soldiers' minds. Not only were they witnessing the widespread use of napalm on innocent civilians before their very eyes, but they were seeing that while dosed up on powerful psychoactive stimulants. Every sight, every sound was heightened to the extreme. They couldn't sleep. Returning home, these soldiers struggled to process what they had witnessed. They weren't sure what was real, what was a nightmare, and what was from the drugs. Their own memories of the events lied to them. Many simply couldn't cope. Post-war support for these veterans was inadequate, to say the least. But there was one group of soldiers affected more harshly than any others. Of course, we're talking about those recruited through Robert McNamara's Project 100,000. The true extent of the damage done to the lives of these men was only made apparent years after the end of the war. In 2015, Gregory Hamilton estimated that members of the so-called Moron Corps died at 3 times the rate of the average U.S. soldier in Vietnam. Remember the promises that Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert McNamara had made? This would be an opportunity for these men. They would learn through military training, raising their intelligence level. They would gain relevant skills and experience through their service that would help them gain employment on the other side. Together, they would end the war on poverty. McNamara gave this speech at the dawn of the program. What these men badly need is a sense of personal achievement, a sense of succeeding at some task, a sense of their own intrinsic potential. They've grown up in an atmosphere of drift and discouragement. It is not simply the sometimes squalid ghettos of their external environment that has debilitated them, but an internal and more destructive ghetto of personal disillusionment and despair, a ghetto of the human spirit. In contrast, after the end of the war, the Department of Defense published these findings, comparing the lives of Project 100,000's veterans to non-veterans in the same bracket. Comparisons between Project 100,000 participants and their non-veteran peers showed that in terms of employment status, educational achievement, and income, non-veterans appeared better off. Veterans were more likely to be unemployed and to have a significantly lower level of education. Income differences ranged from $5,000 to $7,000 in favor of non-veterans. Veterans were more likely to have been divorced. The traumas of war had ruined the lives of countless American troops. High IQ soldiers were struggling to make sense of what they had seen and done. How much worse had those mental scars been for those with disabilities? This is exactly why IQ thresholds and physical requirements existed in the soldiers' tests, to protect those who would face significantly higher risks in the military. In 1995, Myra McPherson published a review questioning the political motivations behind the decision to launch Project 100,000. The reason enlistment was low was because privileged middle and upper-class citizens were doing all in their power to avoid the draft. Rather than closing the loopholes, making college-educated men serve in lower ranks, and preventing the rich and famous from escaping the war, the U.S. government decided to plug the gaps with the most disadvantaged members of society. In 2006, the New York Times branded it as a failed experiment. It provided to be a distraction for the military and of little benefit to the men it was created to help. All of that bloodshed and pain and trauma for a failed experiment. June 11, 1969, Baria City, Vung Tau Province, Vietnam. A newbie tunnel rat arrived at the base to a scene of utter destruction. Just days earlier, a platoon was hit by an M16 mine, aka the Jumping Jack. It got that name for the way it jumped in the air when stepped on. It killed 3 men and injured 24 others. Not long after the hidden enemy laid an anti-personnel mine, a personnel carrier hit that mine. It was the first time that the unseasoned tunnel rat saw a dead body. It was chaos, each and every day. He had to learn fast. The #1 tunnel rat, nicknamed Yogi, was hit twice by mines. Bits were hanging off him as he told the newbie what he had to do next. This was not a job for the faint of heart, but someone had to do it. That story is true. It happened to a combat engineer in the Australian Army. He took on one of the hardest and scariest roles in the war, that of a tunnel rat. We'll get back to his story, but first, let's talk about the job. Prior to the Americans going to war with the Viet Cong, the French fought the Viet Minh from 1946 to 1954. During that time, the Viet Minh learned a thing or two about fighting a superpower. To beat someone far more powerful than yourself, you had to resort to guerrilla tactics. One of those tactics was keeping below ground, and so the Viet Minh got to work building a massive complex of tunnels. When the Americans arrived in 1955, the tunnels were already vast, but it was the Viet Cong that really made them a feat of engineering. During the Vietnam War, or the American War to the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong used those tunnels for all kinds of things. While the opening to the tunnels was small, they might lead to a complex system of tunnels that would lead to large underground spaces. It was within these spaces that the Viet Cong would hide, eat, sleep, and machinate attacks on their enemy. The tunnels served as headquarters, hospitals, barracks, and storage facilities. Since they had ventilation systems, it was possible to stay down there for a prolonged period of time. So we're not so much talking about men burrowing like rabbits, but men living in a subterranean world. These worlds provided safety from the hostiles. Like snakes, the men would come out of them at night, lay traps for the enemy, and sneak back into the tunnel. And that's how so many American and Australian soldiers lost their lives, to mine-laying soldiers that were rarely seen above ground. It was actually an Australian combat engineering unit, the 3 Field Force, that were the first tunnel rats. The Americans later joined them, but we don't imagine guys were queuing up for the job. Just imagine it. They find the entrance but have no idea where the tunnel will lead or who they will encounter down there. That wasn't the only threat of humans to worry about, too. Vietnam is in the tropics, and the tropics are home to all kinds of dangerous creatures. Have you ever seen a Vietnamese giant centipede? Those fast-moving, prehistoric-looking creatures deliver one of the most painful insect bites known to man. And guess what? They too like to hide in tunnels. Then there were the snakes, the highly venomous and deadly banded krait, the malignant pit viper, the king cobra, and a whole host of other badass snakes that can spoil a person's day. The soldiers had to deal with ants' nests, annoying bats, rats carrying the bubonic plague, as well as spiders that weren't generally a threat to life, but could make life painful. So you can imagine that going into one of those tunnels was about as frightening as getting into Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle, but they had to do it, lest more men get blown to bits by these damned jumping jack mines. If the men can infiltrate the tunnels, they might not only kill a few of the enemy, but they would usually come across a stash of mines, grenades, and guns. There was another problem concerning arms. The tunnels were small, and so that meant that the tunnel rats couldn't take larger guns down them. They were usually only equipped with an M1911 pistol or an M1917 revolver. They'd also have a flashlight, a knife, and usually some explosives so they could blow up whatever they found down there. You can just picture it, a man crawling through the darkness, his flashlight in one hand and his pistol in the other. He crawls, and then he sees the enemy, he shoots, and then all he can hear is ringing in his ears. He's blinded by the flash and deafened by the noise. Then the earth above his head starts to fall. He needs to get out fast. What he doesn't know is that the Viet Cong have something special for him: poisonous gas. And this tunnel rat didn't choose the gas mask option because the last time he wore one he could barely see. If the gas doesn't get him, the flood will. The Viet Cong designed this particular tunnel with a flooding feature if it should ever be infiltrated. Other times, the tunnel might just collapse, which wasn't a design feature but a case of poor construction. You'd have to be crazy to do this job. You also had to be short. Imagine a hulk of a man with quite the belly trying to navigate around a tunnel. Soldiers that were picked for the job were usually not taller than 165 centimeters. It was the same years later when the US Marine Corps and British Royal Marines fought in the Afghanistan War. Yeah, tunnel rats weren't only a thing in Vietnam. But let's stay with Vietnam for now and go back to the Australian soldier. He was trained at the Australian Army's School of Military Engineering. He actually thought that this line of study would mean he'd be facing less combat and doing more engineering. He was wrong. He was being trained to become a tunnel rat. That meant learning about things such as mine detection, disarming booby traps, safely blowing stuff up, and learning how to get through tunnels. When he arrived in Vietnam, he walked into chaos. As we said, one of the first things he saw was the aftermath of a soldier stepping on a jumping jack mine. 3 bodies were outfitted with body bags, and after that, 24 men were wounded. He said those M16 mines were everywhere, and it was part of his job to find them. What the Viet Cong did was store them in the tunnels and then lay them at night. So each day was a new day, and there was always a possibility of new mines lying around. That's why the tunnel rat had such an important job. Find where the mines were stored and blow up the tunnel, and then no more mines. When he started the job, he worked as a tunnel rat number 2. He worked in a pair with tunnel rat number 1, and when 6 months was up, he became number 1, and he was joined by a newbie. He hadn't been a number 2 for long when he heard that a number 1 tunnel rat named Yogi had stood on a mine. Yogi was alive, but as you can imagine, he wasn't looking too well. In fact, only 3 Australians that stood on mines made it back home with their legs and lives intact. Yogi was one of them. He was lucky. The fatality rate in his unit was 33%. That's one reason why going into tunnels was not a prospect most soldiers liked. The Americans wanted to destroy the tunnels not from the inside but from the outside. If you dropped enough bombs on suspected tunnels, then they would cave in and anyone inside would suffocate. If you sprayed poisonous gases into them, the Viet Cong would die. You could also try and flood the area where the tunnels were, and by doing that, drown the enemy. The problem was that these efforts didn't always result in success. The reason for that was the fact that the Viet Cong made more impressive tunnels. They made them blast-proof, flood-proof, and provided extra ventilation so the gases weren't effective. They also made them in a zigzag shape to mitigate the effect of an explosion. This is why the tunnel rat was indispensable. Those guys were the only thing that really worked. Believe it or not, most American soldiers were not chosen to do this job, but actually volunteered. Most soldiers thought you'd have to be out of your mind to do the work. The centipedes and the snakes were one thing, but suffocation in a collapsed tunnel was something from a nightmare. So why did they volunteer? One soldier back then said it was sometimes a macho thing. Soldiers did it to show others just how tough they were. He said that many tunnel rats had had problematic lives back home in the US, so they wanted to show that they could be useful. And useful they were, as well as brave. One tunnel rat named C.W. Bowman said that his fellow soldiers thought he was a maniac doing the job. He said they took bets each time he went into a tunnel, and some men betted that he would die. Some men almost did, and this would become a weakness for the US military. We'll get around to that soon. Let's first take you through a mission. You shoot first and ask questions later. That was the mantra of the tunnel rat. Anything they came across, they shot at. They would usually fire only 3 bullets and then reload. The reason for this was the enemy wouldn't know how many bullets they had in the chamber. Let's say the mission was successful, and that the tunnel rat took out the enemy and discovered what was hidden down there. What would they find? On one mission, the tunnel was around 120 feet. At the end of the tunnel, the rat found places where men cooked and slept. As for items, he discovered 8 rifle grenades, 40 pounds of salt, and 6,000 pounds of rice, all of which was destroyed. On another mission, the tunnel rats found cameras, films, and printing presses, as well as weapons and ammunition. There was still a problem though, and that was the fact that even if the tunnel rats were successful, the Americans still had a problem winning the war. You can take out the tunnel, but there will always be more. This is a quote from Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam. You can kill 10 of our men for every 1 we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win. Take for instance the use of booby traps, horrific things that killed around 11% of American soldiers during the war. Sometimes the Viet Cong would put a punji stake trap in a larger part of the tunnel. These were holes filled with sharpened bamboo that would be covered with branches and leaves. When a soldier stood on the trap, the spikes would impale him, and worse, the spikes might have been daubed with poison or feces. The soldier would then scream out, but he wouldn't die. This was the point, because the Viet Cong wanted more men to go down into the tunnel. Not only were there often more traps down there, but even if there weren't, pulling an injured man off sharp sticks and dragging him out through the tunnel was very time-consuming. The Viet Cong would later say that the Americans spent so much time and energy rescuing their injured comrades that they had lots of time to regroup and plan what they were going to do next. The sheer horror of these traps were also very bad for morale. This is what Ho Chi Minh was referring to when he said the Americans would not be victorious. He was right too. There were other kinds of traps. A tunnel rat might have hit a tripwire while crawling, and then the tunnel would have collapsed on him. There's a story of a tunnel rat that popped his head out of one entrance and that triggered a spear that went through his neck. At other times, the Viet Cong made traps like something you might have seen in an Indiana Jones movie. A man could hit a tripwire in a tunnel, and then a concrete ball studded with spikes would come flying at him. A lieutenant named Jack Flowers said he experienced a totally different kind of trap. His comrade went into a tunnel, and that man triggered a tripwire. After that, a box full of scorpions rained down on him. Snakes were also used. Sometimes the Viet Cong would place them in bamboo and tie them to the roof of the tunnel. When a soldier hit the bamboo, the snake would pop out and bite the man in his face. They scared the hell out of the soldiers, some of whom called them three-step snakes, because after you were bitten, you only had 3 steps before you died. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but you can imagine being stuck in a dark tunnel with scorpions and snakes. Flowers went into over 100 tunnels. He later said this about the expeditions: "In these tunnels, your adrenaline was pumping like a river. I swear I could hear my heart beating. You'd feel your way along for booby traps. It got so you could sense them. Same for the VC. You could smell another human being in the tunnel. You knew he was waiting for you in the dark." All of these horrors that the Viet Cong created instilled so much fear in the men that volunteering to be a tunnel rat wasn't exactly on every soldier's mind. But someone had to do it. They had to do it for the team, so to speak. This is what one American said about hiding in tunnels: "We often wondered how things happened in the night, and we never saw what was going on. Guys getting their throats cut. Nobody ever knew where these guys were coming from. They had to go down every tunnel they could find, otherwise strange things happened during the night. It created tremendous psychological stress not knowing where the enemy was, so sending down tunnel rats was some peace of mind." There were successful tunnel campaigns, such as Operation Crimp and Operation Cedar Falls, but in the end, the Viet Cong proved to be more resilient. While the American soldiers were literally having nervous breakdowns going into the tunnels, the Vietnamese soldiers were at home in them. If the tunnels were destroyed, they just built more of them. The Americans had the task of Sisyphus, pushing the giant rock up a slope for eternity. As for the fate of the tunnel rats, there isn't any data on how many of them died, but it's thought that most of them succumbed during those horrific explorations of the Vietnamese subterrane. Out of 100 or so tunnel rats in the American Army, only 12 of them lived to tell the tale of those tunnels back on American soil. One of those men was Jack Flowers. He later said, "Why did we do it? I wasn't a tough guy. Nobody who knows me would ever suspect I could do what the tunnel rats did. I'd never want a son of mine to have to do it. Thank God," he said, "that these days men don't have to do what he did." One rainy day in the mid-1930s, a peculiar young officer smartly paraded up to the front of his platoon's formation and snapped into place with full military precision. Unlike the rest of his platoon, however, this particular officer was carrying an umbrella. Red in the face with anger and dripping wet in rain, the battalion adjutant immediately stormed over and demanded to know what in the blue blazes the officer was thinking carrying an umbrella to formation. Without missing a beat, the young officer simply responded, "Because it's raining, sir." John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, or as he would later be known, Mad Jack or Fighting Jack, would be immediately reprimanded for his insubordination and preposterousness. But such reprimands were nothing new for the very bored officer. Amidst the brief interlude of peace between World War I and World War II, Churchill found his military service, well, rather dull. A rare breed of man, practically born to lead others on the battlefield, Churchill itched for excitement and chaos. When life failed to provide any, he sought it out himself, and at a time when roads were mostly non-existent in India, rode his motorcycle over 1,500 miles of the Southeast Asian countryside, often crossing rivers and chasms by pushing his bike along the rails of railroad tracks while he carefully stepped across the crossbeams. To ease his peacetime boredom, Churchill also taught himself how to play the bagpipes, which at the time was not a particularly popular pastime for proper British men. But not one to half-ass anything, Churchill not only learned to play the bagpipes, he would go on to place second in the officers' class of the piping championships at Aldershot, a stunning feat considering he was the only Englishman amongst the 70 or so competitors. Bagpipes mastered, Churchill also took up a keen interest in archery and became such a proficient archer that he would go on to represent England in an international tournament. Churchill may have been a daredevil and an adrenaline junkie, but that didn't mean he disliked comfort. Quite the opposite. Not only would Churchill earn himself a reprimand for bringing an umbrella to military formation in the pouring rain, but he also was chastised for using a hot water bottle to keep warm at night in his cot, against military protocol. To bypass this minor technicality, Churchill instead used a piece of rubber tubing which he filled with hot water. The regs, after all, forbade the use of hot water bottles, but said nothing about rubber tubes. While most military men measure their alleged toughness by their ability to suffer hardship, Churchill saw no need for such inane displays of machismo, or perhaps he was, as many sources state, bored out of his mind by peace and entertained himself by annoying his senior leadership. Whatever the truth, if anyone thought Churchill was a soft man because he preferred to stay dry in the rain and sleep in warm comfort, they would be sorely mistaken, as the world was about to find out with the outbreak of World War II. In 1939, the German army invaded Poland from one side as the Russians invaded from another. Polish defenders were caught between the two surging armies and quickly surrendered. The hostilities prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, and at last Churchill's long stretch of peacetime boredom came to an end, commenting that "I was back in my red coat, the country having gotten to a jam in my absence." Churchill left behind his brief peacetime life of modeling and appearing in famous films as an extra to ship out to France. However, upon arriving, Churchill was immediately disappointed. Despite German aggression against the Poles and Britain and France's declaration of war, both nations simply took up positions along the French-Maginot Line and did, well, nothing. Troops simply held their ground and generally tried not to be bored for weeks upon weeks, the lack of offensive operations being the result of Britain and France's lack of preparations for war, what historians would end up calling a slight oversight. Britain and France had completely failed to fully prepare for conflict, despite years of ratcheting German aggression and a whole lot of angry, tiny mustache chest-pounding from Adolf Hitler. Whatever the case, Churchill found himself a victim of Allied unreadiness, a situation which did not suit him at all. There was a war on, damn it, and like a puppy straining on the leash, Churchill wanted his share of it. With the Soviets invading Finland, Churchill joined a volunteer detachment of British soldiers sent to aid Finn forces. They might not be Germans, but fighting anyone who was being an international dick was better than fighting nobody, Churchill supposed. Bidding his comrades adieu, Churchill joined the Finnish detachment. But before the expedition could get all the way to Finland, it was cancelled on account of some sudden and very severe German rudeness across the entire Maginot Line. Finland would have to fend for itself against the Soviets. At last, the proper war was on. Returning to his comrades, Churchill was immediately displeased at the British Army's failure to hold its ground against the overwhelming German blitzkrieg of tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of tanks, and an equal number of fighters and bombers. Churchill and his unit were then ordered to retreat, making for Dunkirk, where rescue awaited for the overwhelmed British and French forces. And if that rescue failed, the war could come to a very sudden and unpleasant end for the Allies. More than a fair bit annoyed at having to retreat, Churchill decided to creatively reinterpret his orders, and rather than simply fall back en masse, he engaged in an aggressive campaign of guerrilla raids and counterattacks against the German forces, leading small teams of hand-picked men. Churchill would rush roaring a battle cry into battle, holding aloft a large two-handed sword. Like some anachronistic Highlander, Churchill waded into enemy fire and on more than one occasion spitted a German soldier on his claymore. Other times, Churchill would discard his rifle in favor of his longbow, sinking barbed shafts into the chests of Germans up to 100 yards away. Rumor has it that during one battle, a German officer asked for a list of casualties and injuries, only to be told that several of the casualties had been shot with arrows. The confused and irate officer warned his junior officer not to joke around with him, only to be shown the bodies with arrows still sticking out of them. Professional soldiers always expect the unexpected in combat, but nobody expected a mad Englishman shooting arrows in the midst of the greatest industrial age war in human history. During a lull in the fighting, Mad Jack Churchill, as he was now known, was spotted by a fellow officer riding his signature motorcycle, longbow on his back. arrows sticking out of packs strapped to his body, and a German officer's cap on the motorcycle's headlamp. As Mad Jack dismounted, the officer noted a streak of blood across his ear and neck and asked about the fresh injury. Asking for a stiff drink in return, Churchill responded that he and his men had ran into a German machine gun and his men had screamed for him to run, but he had simply been too tired to. Churchill had thought it's simpler to destroy the machine gun nest, even after being shot through the neck. Successfully making it across the channel back to England, Churchill got wind of a new military organization being formed, called the Commandos. The request for volunteers was secretive, but promised aggressive military service, which was more than good enough for Churchill. The progenitors to Britain's modern special forces, commando service included weeks of training in demolitions, firearms, infiltration, and all manner of other topics which Churchill absolutely adored. During commando training, however, Churchill also met a woman whom he would immediately marry and remain happily married to for 55 years until his death. On December 27, 1941, Churchill had his chance to rejoin the war as the newly formed commandos assaulted the German garrison at Vågsøy in Norway. Tasked with destroying the onshore artillery in preparation for a full-scale assault, Churchill stood in the lead landing craft with bagpipes, belting out the March of the Cameron Men as enemy machine guns strafed the oncoming boats. As soon as the ramps lowered, Churchill waded ashore ahead of his men, holding aloft his sword and, as one soldier put it, uttering warlike cries. A half-hour later, Churchill sent out a brief telegraph to headquarters, reading simply, "Malloy Battery and Island captured. Casualties slight. Demolitions in progress. Churchill." Churchill would go on to win several military honors, as well as more than a few battle scars. But his greatest feats of valor would not come until the autumn of 1943, leading the Allied landings at Salerno in Italy. Churchill and his commandos found themselves fighting alongside American Rangers in the town of Marina. Both Churchill's commandos and the American Rangers were not designed to fight and operate as normal line infantry, lacking much of the heavy fire support that normal infantry brings to a fight, such as heavy machine guns and mortars. Armed mostly with rifles and grenades so that they could remain mobile, the commandos and rangers found themselves at a severe disadvantage as German and Italian heavy infantry assaulted their position in waves. Though casualties were extremely high, the Allied forces beat back every assault. Growing bored of simply waiting for the Germans to come to him to get shot, Churchill decided it would be best to go where they were instead and shoot them there. Ignoring the fact that his forces were grossly outnumbered and had no heavy weapons and absolutely zero support, Churchill led a night raid against a heavily defended German position, rushing out from thick undergrowth and shouting "Commando!" Churchill and his small detachment destroyed the German position and took 136 prisoners. Churchill and one of his corporals, however, had managed to get themselves far ahead of the rest of their unit in the fighting, and suddenly heard the sound of dozens of Germans digging into fighting positions all around them in the nighttime darkness. Never one to waste a good opportunity, Churchill decided that it wouldn't do to march back to friendly lines alone, and instead unsheathed his giant sword and simply walked to the first German position, ordering the men to put their hands up in German. Perhaps thinking themselves visited by the ghost of an ancient medieval man, or simply doubting that even their bullets would touch a man with balls of steel so sturdy he waded into battle carrying a giant freaking sword. The Germans obliged and were taken prisoner. Churchill, however, wasn't done. He thought it wouldn't do for his German prisoners to be lonely, and thus decided to visit another German position. By the end of the night, Churchill and his corporal took 42 German prisoners, leading them back to the British and American lines at Sword Point. Churchill would go on to explain to a senior officer that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you're senior to him, he will cry "Jawohl!" and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation. That's why they make such marvelous soldiers. A few months later, however, Churchill himself would be taken prisoner, surrounded on all sides by Germans and with just 6 men and himself left alive, and with nothing more than revolvers and a single American carbine between them. Churchill fought on until the ammunition ran out, and a mortar killed 3 of his other men and wounded another. With nothing left to shoot back with, and apparently separated from his trusty sword, Churchill pulled out his bagpipes and prepared to meet his end, playing "Will Ye No Come Back Again," until a German grenade knocked him unconscious. Churchill would be sent to a POW camp, but was quickly growing bored of not killing Germans. He hastily made an escape. Upon his recapture, he was sent to an even more well-guarded POW camp. only to escape again. Meeting up with a column of American armor, Churchill was rescued but appalled to hear that the war was nearly over. Returning to his unit, Churchill commented, "There are still nips, aren't there?" And thus Churchill volunteered to ship off to the Pacific. Sadly for Churchill, upon his arrival, the Americans dropped their second nuclear bomb, and the Japanese quickly surrendered. A heartbroken Churchill would go on to say to a friend, "If it hadn't been for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going on for another 10 years. Telling another friend that the Japanese had double-crossed him by surrendering, Churchill immediately began to look for an opportunity to join the many brush wars raging in the aftermath of World War II. He got his chance in 1948 when Arab forces tried to drive the Jews from what would become Israel. Present in his full dress uniform at a battalion parade, Churchill got news that a Jewish medical convoy had been ambushed by Arab forces. Not wasting a moment, Churchill immediately rushed to their aid, still wearing full dress uniform. Boldly rushing down the middle of the road and into the teeth of the battle, Churchill commented later that "I grinned like mad from side to side, as people are less likely to shoot you if you smile at them." Churchill would go on to rescue 700 Jewish civilians and earn greater military honors for his deeds. At the end of the hostilities, Churchill then went to teach at various military schools, ending his career while serving as an instructor at the Land Air Warfare School in Australia. Giving up on its many attempts to kill him, life would let Churchill live out his days happily next to his wife until his peaceful death in 1996, leaving behind an extraordinary legacy of courage and, well, no small amount of lunacy. Best remembered for his signature claymore which he waded into battle with, Churchill once answered a general awarding him a decoration who asked about the weapon by saying, "In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." A soldier carefully walks through the dense jungles of Vietnam. Suddenly, he stumbles across a hidden tripwire, and with a sudden swoosh, a massive mace made out of bamboo and fitted with spikes comes swinging down out of the tree cover, smashing into his chest. Next to him, his buddy makes one false step, and after a slight click, an explosion rips his foot and most of his lower leg off. This is the hell that was the most terrifying booby traps of the Vietnam War. A booby trap simply known as the mace was not only terrifying but deadly upon impact. As U.S. soldiers walked along jungle paths making their way to their next objective, they could be ambushed from above. The mace was a large ball made of wood or metal covered in spikes, secured in the jungle's trees. The spikes were made out of bamboo, branches, or even metal. The mace would be secured in the tree and tied to a tripwire. When an unsuspecting soldier snagged his boot on the wire, it would trigger the release of the spiked ball, which would swing down from the trees and impale itself into the soldier's skull. This would most likely cause immediate death, but if it did not, the soldier would wish he were dead. There would be no way for the spikes to be pulled out without killing the wounded soldier, so the mace either caused death upon impact or soon after. A simpler version of the mace could be constructed using materials found only in the jungle. This made the mace a versatile booby trap. Viet Cong soldiers could sharpen bamboo into pointed stakes, then stick them through a large ball of mud. When left in the sun, the mud would harden and secure the bamboo spikes in place. Then the Viet Cong could tie the mace to a tree using vines or cords. All of this could be done by a single soldier and then left alone until an unsuspecting victim triggered it. The ability to construct booby traps out of the jungle itself became a common theme with the Viet Cong, and each booby trap they created was more terrifying than the next. One of the most well-known booby traps used by the Viet Cong were punji sticks. These were sharpened bamboo stakes that were placed in a camouflaged hole. If a soldier fell into the pit, they would be impaled on the stakes. It was a truly horrible trap, but was super effective. The thick jungles of Vietnam allowed this booby trap to be set almost anywhere and easily disguised. The way it worked was the Viet Cong soldiers would dig a hole deep enough and place the sharpened punji sticks face up. Then they would weave a bunch of branches and leaves together to make a false ground. This would be placed over the hole to disguise it as debris that had fallen onto a path. The hole would be almost impossible to see, but if a soldier stepped on the disguised canopy, they would instantly fall into the pit and impale themselves on the sharpened bamboo. However, this booby trap could be made even worse by a few gross additions. Some punji sticks were lined with regular sharpened bamboo, while others had spikes covered in human feces or animal waste. This would increase the chances of infection if a soldier was cut open by one of the sticks, but did not die. In the jungle, an open wound would not stay clean for long, and since it was rare that a platoon would carry antibiotics, it would most likely get infected, causing the soldier to become very ill. This is because the humidity and the temperature are the perfect environment for bacteria to breed and cause mayhem in the body. If you add a biological component such as fecal matter or waste to the wound, it almost always guaranteed an infection will develop. This would slow down entire squads as they tried to carry their wounded back to base, making them easier targets for ambush. So it would seem the Viet Cong were not only using the punji sticks as booby traps, but as a form of biological warfare as well. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, there was another awful way in which the punji sticks were being used. The punji sticks could be cut and placed in a way that made them more like barbs than spears. Sometimes they'd be placed upside down so the soldier who fell in wouldn't necessarily get hurt too bad when they fell into the pit, but as they tried to climb out, the punji sticks would tear through their flesh, opening multiple wounds. As the unlucky soldier either tried to claw their way out of the pit or were pulled up by their squad mates, it would be almost inevitable that one of the punji sticks would pierce their skin. This is when covering the points in bacteria-laden waste would cause the most damage. It would almost be worse to be wounded rather than die by being impaled. By slowly succumbing to infection, the screams of the wounded soldier would not only give the squad's location away, but the slower pace would make the grueling trek through the jungle even more perilous. But there is a worse pit to fall into than one filled with punji sticks. An unlucky soldier that stepped in the wrong place might find themselves in the bottom of a pit filled with venomous snakes. In the words of Indiana Jones, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? This would be on the mind of any soldier who fell into a hidden viper pit. The hole itself would be camouflaged in a way similar to punji sticks booby traps, but instead of sharpened bamboo in the bottom of the hole, there would be hundreds of snakes. When the soldier fell in, he would disturb the already hungry and disgruntled snakes, causing them to attack immediately. As he writhed around covered in the vipers, the soldier would receive bite after bite filled with venom. And these weren't just ordinary snakes, they were bamboo pit vipers. These snakes may not have been very big, but their venom is deadly. A single bite from one of these snakes could kill a healthy, full-grown adult within minutes. And they were actually nicknamed the two-step snake by the soldiers. This was because the venom of a bite from a bamboo pit viper would cause a soldier to collapse after only taking 2 more steps. And if there were any baby snakes in the hole, the pit became even more deadly. Young snakes still produce venom, but they can't control how much is released with a single bite. This means when bit by a baby viper, they release their entire venom payload into the victim, making them even more deadly than the adults. Regardless of age of the snakes in the pits, there would always be a lot of them. Any soldier who fell in would be repeatedly bit and had 0 chance of making it back to base alive. The vipers were not only used by the Viet Cong in camouflaged pits, but in many other types of booby traps as well. In fact, the vipers were a natural booby trap that was plentiful in the jungle. The Viet Cong soldiers would often carry a pit viper in their packs. This was a way to booby trap their own supplies if they were killed or captured by the enemy. It also served as a deterrent from anyone going through their supplies without permission. If a United States soldier came across a Viet Cong pack, they would open it to see if anything was useful inside. However, if it was booby-trapped with a bamboo pit viper, the soldier might be bitten as they reached into the pack to see what it contained. This was a deterrent, but if the Viet Cong soldier got lucky, the snake could kill anyone trying to steal their supplies as well. The pit viper was also used to booby-trap the tunnels that the Viet Cong used as a means to get around and stay hidden. As U.S. soldiers crawled through the tunnels looking for any enemy soldiers, they might come across these deadly snakes tied to sticks or placed in the holes in the wall. Crawling through the dark tunnel complexes was scary enough, but not knowing if there were venomous snakes set as booby traps throughout them must have been terrifying. A soldier that was focused on what was ahead of them might miss a pit viper on the ground or hanging from the tunnel ceiling. One wrong step by the U.S. soldier could mean a fatal bite, causing him to collapse and die in the blackness of the Viet Cong tunnels. Snakes were used to booby trap pretty much anything that could have been valuable to the enemy. They were hidden in weapons caches, food stores, and supply crates. Basically, if a U.S. soldier found a Viet Cong supply stash, they needed to proceed with caution and assume it was booby-trapped in some way. Snakes were not the only terrifying booby trap used to deter U.S. soldiers from going through Viet Cong supplies, though. Others included sharp blades, rigged explosives, and live ammunition. These types of booby traps came to be known as keepsake lose-hand traps. If a soldier was going to go rummaging through the stash of Viet Cong supplies or personal items, there was a good chance they would encounter a booby trap of some kind. So if a soldier stuck their hand into something to try to remove a keepsake, they might lose their hand to one of these next crazy booby traps. A seemingly innocent supply stash was often rigged with explosives. This was done to deter U.S. soldiers from taking military supplies, food, and anything that would help them defeat the Viet Cong in the war. It was better for supplies to be blown up than fall into enemy hands. Viet Cong supply caches would have grenades wedged in them, so if a soldier started moving things around, the pin would be pulled out and the grenade would detonate. These traps were often lethal, but like the punji sticks, if the grenade maimed or seriously injured a soldier, it could actually be worse. Pieces of shrapnel could be shot in every direction, wounding multiple targets at once, and making the entire platoon vulnerable to counterattack. The chances of surviving a grenade at close proximity were not good. But the chances of surviving a serious injury without putting the rest of your squad mates in danger was even worse. A favorite type of Viet Cong booby trap actually had nothing to do with useful supplies at all, but with flags. The Viet Cong figured out early on that when the United States soldiers secured a base or outpost, they would just take down the VC flag that was currently flying there. Sometimes this was just to replace the flag with an American one, so the Allies knew the outpost was under their control. Other times, soldiers would keep the flag as memorabilia. This led to the Viet Cong booby trapping their flags with bombs. Flag bombs went something like this. The Viet Cong would realize they could no longer hold a base, so they quickly grabbed everything they could and made a run for it. But while others were gathering supplies, some soldiers were tasked with booby trapping parts of the base. They would hide grenades in the pit vipers and supply caches. Sometimes they would rig entire ammunition stores to explode. The final thing to be done before abandoning the base would be to plant the flag bomb. A Viet Cong soldier would connect a nearly invisible wire to the pulley system on the flagpole and bury an explosive at the base. Then they would retreat into the jungle and head to their next objective. Eventually, the US soldiers would enter the abandoned base and search for anything of use. Someone would be in charge of bringing down the enemy flag, so it was clear the base was captured. Unfortunately for that unlucky soldier, when they pulled the drawstring to lower the flag, the explosive would be triggered and detonate right under their feet. A modified version of this booby trap was also used in the jungle itself, making walking down paths or following a Viet Cong party extremely dangerous. The US soldiers needed to watch every step they took, or it could be their last. A common booby trap that every soldier needed to be wary of was the grenade in a can. This was simple but a deadly trap that could be deployed anywhere and at any time. The way a grenade in a can worked was that two empty metal cans would be wedged into the ground or mounted in the trees along a path. The safety pins of both grenades would be removed. Then the live grenades would be stuffed into the cans, making sure the striker levers remained in place until the grenades were pulled out. After each can and grenade was secured, a tripwire would be tied to each end of the grenade. When the enemy soldier stepped on or pulled the wire with their boot, the grenades would be torn out of the cans and instantly explode. Even if only one grenade was pulled out, the detonation would most likely cause the second one to explode. Having two grenades go off along a path with multiple soldiers walking down it would be devastating. The soldier that tripped the booby trap would not be the only one in the kill zone. Instead, the entire squad could be in jeopardy. Sharp pieces of metal from the can and the grenade would mix with razor-sharp splinters of wood from the surrounding vegetation. If a soldier tripped a grenade in a can before being able to alert the rest of their squad, it could be deadly for almost everyone in the area. The traps were super simple, yet extremely effective, making their proliferation across the Vietnam jungle widespread. The saddest part of it all is that there was no way to know where all of the grenade in a can booby traps were set after the war ended. This meant that innocent Vietnamese people, including women and children, who traveled the jungle paths to get back to their homes, could inadvertently trip one of the booby traps. This could cause a massive amount of pain and suffering even after the war was long over. Another dangerous booby trap was not quite as deadly as the grenade in a can, however, it could still cause a lot of pain and even the loss of a foot. These traps were known as cartridge traps or toe poppers. The way they worked was truly diabolical. A small hole would be dug by a Viet Cong soldier, a round of ammunition would be placed in a piece of bamboo, and then carefully lowered into the hole. At the base of the bamboo would be a piece of wood with a nail sticking out of it. The hole would then be concealed with a very thin covering and left for someone to step on. When a soldier put their boot down on the booby trap, their weight would push the cartridge down and the nail would pierce the bottom of the bullet. This would cause the round to fire straight up, blowing a hole through the soldier's foot. The soldier would be incapacitated and their squad mates would need to rush to help them. The cartridge trap was usually not lethal but would definitely stop a squad in its tracks until the wounded soldier could be bandaged up. However, sometimes larger cartridges were used. They could be so powerful that an unlucky soldier with his entire body over the cartridge trap could have the bullet exit through his foot and tear into other parts of his body. And heaven forbid the soldier was looking down at the time and got the bullet straight to the face. This would obviously be a lethal scenario. What made the cartridge trap so effective is that it was almost impossible to detect. The hole the bamboo and ammunition were placed into was not very big, and since there was no wires involved, there was nothing on the surface to indicate that a booby trap was present there. Unless a squad had someone with a metal detector, a cartridge trap would most likely go unnoticed until it went off. And even if a soldier did have a metal detector due to the size of the trap, they would need to be relatively close to it before it would be detectable, and by then it may have been too late. A booby trap which was truly terrible could not be prevented by using a metal detector or any other method other than springing the trap itself or getting really lucky. A booby trap known as a bamboo whip could be made anywhere in the jungles of Vietnam using only things found in nature. This trap was constructed by finding a long, thin piece of bamboo and cutting it down. Then smaller pieces of bamboo would be chopped up and sharpened. If there was no rope available, the sharpened bamboo stakes could be secured to the long piece of bamboo using cordage or vines. The spiked bamboo whip would be secured to a tree on the side of a path or an area with heavy U.S. traffic. It would be pulled back into the jungle, which would create tension that, when released, would cause the bamboo whip to swing forward at lightning speed and strike whatever was in its path with enormous force. Bamboo is not only versatile but incredibly strong. It can withstand large amounts of pressure before snapping, which means a ton of stored energy can be maintained for a long period of time before being released. The pulled-back bamboo whip would then be secured using a tripwire. Again, if the Viet Cong only had materials of the jungle available to them, the tripwire could also be made out of vines. When U.S. soldiers walked down the path and someone tripped the whip, the long piece of bamboo would swing forward and the sharpened spikes would impale themselves into the body of the unlucky soldier who was in the front. The bamboo whip could be positioned at different heights as well. The Viet Cong could rig it so that when the spikes came around, they slammed into someone's shins or upper thighs. This would not be deadly, but the amount of time and effort it would take to remove each stake from the soldier's legs without having him bleed to death would be tedious. Also, the tips of the stakes could be covered in biological waste like the punji sticks, causing almost immediate infection and eventual death. But the bamboo whip could also be elevated, meaning that when it swung around, it could impale itself into a soldier's stomach or chest. This would cause almost immediate death if it struck a vital organ. Or if it just pierced an organ, the soldier could be in excruciating pain until he eventually succumbed to internal bleeding. A much rarer situation due to accuracy limitations would be that the bamboo whip was placed at neck and head height. If placed at the correct position when the bamboo whip was released, the spikes could enter the neck, causing the soldier to choke on his own blood. It could also enter the face or eye sockets, leading to immediate death as the spike entered the brain. The Viet Cong were also good at using the United States' own weapons against them when improvising some booby traps. If the Viet Cong came across a U.S. mine, they would not destroy it but repurpose it into a booby trap. They would dig it up and place the mine somewhere else, hoping that an enemy soldier would step on it or a vehicle would drive over it. However, these were not the only source of mines at their disposal. The region had been at war for several decades in one way or another. The Viet Cong had gathered up explosives from the South Vietnamese army and older French mines that were left lying around after the First Indochina War. And if those sources of mines weren't enough, the Viet Cong were also supplied with ordnances from the Soviet Union and China. This meant that there was almost an endless supply of these deadly booby traps that the Viet Cong could place around the country. Unfortunately, all these mines came with future consequences. Like many other types of booby traps, many were left over or forgotten after the end of the Vietnam War. There are places even today where people need to be careful where they step, in case there's a hidden landmine lurking just under the soil. Approximately 40,000 Vietnamese people have died from landmine explosions since the war's end. Another somewhat ingenious booby trap is reminiscent of something out of the medieval times, except the Viet Cong version had a slight twist. The bow trap looked like a wooden crossbow. This was another one of the booby traps that could be constructed using only materials found in the jungle. This particular device was mostly used at the beginning of the war, as it took a while to build and was not as effective as other booby traps. However, the bow trap could cause all sorts of problems for a United States platoon if they were not careful. The bow was created out of a straightened branch and some rope. A stick would be whittled down to a fine point, and the whole setup would be placed on the stand. The string would then be drawn back and tied to a tripwire. The entire bow could be covered in brush, and since the bow was made out of materials from the jungle, it would blend right in. When a U.S. soldier tripped the wire, the arrow would be released and sunk itself into their body. This was obviously excruciating, and if there were multiple bows set up in the same area, they could lead to several casualties. However, the Viet Cong took things a step further with these booby traps by adding poison to the tips of the arrows. Most of the bow traps were set up to be aimed at the midsection of the body. This allowed for the greatest chance of hitting the target and delivering a fatal dose of pit viper venom and other toxins. The Viet Cong seemed to favor some booby traps over others. This was especially true due to the variety in these next types of traps. Foot traps came in all shapes and sizes in the Vietnam War. Sometimes the Viet Cong would use a metal bear trap that would snap its jaws shut on the ankle of a U.S. soldier who wasn't paying attention. However, the bear traps were limited in supply and could be found easily using metal detectors. Therefore, the Viet Cong began to design their own foot traps. Some of the foot traps were as simple as digging a hole in the ground and lining the sides with sharpened sticks or nails. When a U.S. soldier's foot fell in, the entire leg would be shredded to pieces. Other foot traps used a series of wooden blocks that were embedded with spikes. These worked similarly to bear traps, except they were used creating wood and pointy objects that the Viet Cong had available. The jungle wasn't the only place that contained hazards set up by the Viet Cong. Even when entering huts and buildings, U.S. soldiers needed to be careful. The door trap was easy to make and incredibly deadly. A decent-sized stick with spikes could be suspended above a doorway and tied in place using a tripwire. When a soldier walked through the opening, they would pull the wire, causing the wooden stakes to swing down and slam into their chest. The force at which the door trap was able to send the sharpened wood spikes into a soldier's body made it incredibly deadly. The downside for the Viet Cong was that this trap could only be sprung once, and there would only be one casualty, but it definitely made the US soldiers think twice before entering a building. Booby traps were highly effective at slowing down, killing, or deterring United States soldiers, which was one of the main reasons they were used so often by the Viet Cong. They knew they would never win the war using traditional tactics. The United States military had more advanced ships, aircraft, and vehicles. This meant that the Viet Cong would lose almost every battle they fought if they went head-to-head with a heavily armed US force. They discovered this quickly and almost immediately switched tactics. Women and young children were also used to deploy different kinds of booby traps. This allowed for large areas to be covered in booby traps while the soldiers were deployed in different regions. Every able-bodied person could help in the war effort. Didn't matter who you were, if you could carve a stick and tie some string, you could make a booby trap that would hurt the enemy. According to the Australian Ministry of Defence, around 11% of all deaths and 15% of injuries in the Vietnam War were due to booby traps. The number of US soldiers wounded during the war was around 300,000 men, which means that about 45,000 Americans were injured by the terrifying booby traps of the Viet Cong. When the smoke cleared and the fighting was over, World War I was the deadliest war in human history, with a staggering 10 million military personnel and 7 million civilians dead. 2 decades later, World War II would top this figure, with between 70 and 85 million people killed. World War II alone would kill off 3% of the world's population. But with some of the largest and bloodiest battles in history, you might wonder what happened after the battle to all those dead soldiers and civilians. Disposing of the dead is a vital military task for many reasons. Chief amongst them, though, is the hygienic and morale concerns. Dead bodies littering a battlefield will very quickly lead to outbreaks of disease and illness, and a high enough concentration of dead bodies can even poison local water supplies if a battle took place in the wrong area. With disease being as big a killer in most wars as enemy action, the world very quickly learned that there needed to be an efficient and quick way to dispose of the bodies after combat, or risk the health of the survivors and local communities. Another major concern, though, is the effect that casualties have on overall morale. After all, nobody wants to move through a battlefield to get to the new front lines and be greeted by the grisly remains of hundreds or even thousands of soldiers who came before you and died. During the Allied invasion of Normandy in World War II, the removal of battlefield casualties from the landing beaches became a matter of paramount importance. Men were dispatched to clean up the beaches of both Allied and German corpses, sometimes even having to dive under the water to cut bodies free from the overturned landing craft. It was a grisly business, but one that was vitally necessary in order to protect the morale of troops landing in subsequent waves. In the past, the removal of battlefield casualties was largely left up to local villagers, and if there was time and resources, perhaps some military units. In World War I, individual units were largely responsible for seeing to their own dead, and fellow soldiers would search the battlefield for corpses and deliver them for burial in mass graves. Often, military units would enlist the aid of local villagers to help sort the battlefield for casualties, and the dead of both sides were buried with all their comrades, albeit in different mass graves for the two opposing armies. Usually after a large battle, a local ceasefire would be negotiated, allowing both sides to send men out to recover their dead. When the situation allowed, the men would be buried in individual graves, but typically mass graves were the simplest and therefore preferred option. The location of the graves would be recorded, and later, when time allowed, or perhaps after the war, bodies would be exhumed and then given proper burials. Things improved during World War II somewhat, and more emphasis was placed on proper burials when possible for both enemy and friendly dead. The responsibility still lay with individual units, but both sides had military graves officers whose specific job was burying the dead. The Germans dictated that mass graves were the preferred option for burial, and that these graves should be located near railway lines if possible. The burial site should also include pathways so that after the war, it could be turned into a proper military cemetery. However, as the war raged on, the practice became unfeasible, and mass graves were dug where they could be conveniently located. Local ceasefires were still commonplace after major battles so that both sides could recover their dead. The Allies also left the responsibility of burying their dead largely in the hands of the individual units, who would comb a battlefield after the fight and gather corpses for burial. The Americans, though, had a unit known as the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service, or GRS, who was tasked with the proper burial of American dead. And the incredible lengths to which these men went to ensure the recovery and burial of their dead was nothing short of heroic. A much greater emphasis was placed on proper burial rites for individuals based on their religion, and as often as possible the dead were buried in individual and proper graves instead of mass graves. The GRS units would not just bury American casualties, but any Allied casualty they came across, even Axis soldiers and civilians killed in the crossfire. They would often hire local villagers to help with the task and even used POWs to help dig graves, who were often terrified, believing that they were digging their own graves. The GRS units were well known to go to extraordinary lengths not only to recover bodies, but to identify them and give them proper burials according to the fallen's religious affiliation. The graves would be well marked and the location passed along to relevant authorities, with many of the graves exhumed after the war and the bodies moved to proper military cemeteries across Europe. Identifying the dead could be grisly business, especially given the efficacy of modern weapons. Often inside a burned-out tank, all that could be discovered was molten rings and other jewelry and teeth. If the GRS men were lucky, they may find a dog tag intact. Crawling into crashed airplanes, though, could lead to the discovery of many dead, most of them dismembered and almost impossible to identify. Still, the GRS soldiers diligently worked to pry loose human remains and have them identified any way possible. Dog tags were the primary way of identifying a soldier, but if those were missing, then the men would take prints of all 10 fingers and prepare a dental chart for identification. If the body was in really bad shape, though, a special fluid could be injected into the fingers to allow them to get usable prints. And in severe cases, the men would cut the skin off the tips of the fingers directly. Each soldier's uniform also bore laundry marks, which bore the first letter of the last name and the last 4 digits of their service number. Where once looting of personal effects prevailed, the men of the GRS went to great lengths to protect the personal effects of the dead. Things such as wallets, rings, watches, and photos were all shipped to the Quartermaster's Depot in Kansas City, Missouri, and there they would be cleaned and sent to the next of kin. Blood-stained items and things that could be embarrassing to the family were destroyed on the battlefield, while perishable items such as rations, chewing gum, and cigarettes were distributed amongst the troops. Weapons and ammunition were also gathered up and given to soldiers in need. The GRS men may not have been proper infantry, but that doesn't mean that they operated safely behind friendly lines. In fact, GRS soldiers were amongst the first to land in France during the D-Day invasion, with some of them aboard the gliders that delivered airborne infantry troops behind enemy lines. Their task was grim but necessary, as they were to see to the burial of expected losses amongst the first Allied forces to land in Europe. On the beaches of Normandy, GRS men cut casualties out of landing craft and retrieved their soggy and bloated bodies from the surf. As the war moved east, GRS soldiers followed the front lines, and when winter arrived, their job became that much harder. The snow and ice froze corpses in place, and the men brought bodies into heated morgue tents in order to defrost the bodies enough to allow the recovery of personal effects and to prepare for proper burials. When the offensive crossed into Germany, the Allied casualties were shipped hundreds of miles back to be buried in France, the Netherlands, or Belgium, with the GRS men believing that no family back home would want their dead son to be buried in Germany. At the end of World War II, when everybody else got to go home, the GRS soldiers stayed behind, going back over the battlefields of Europe, looking for hastily dug graves that had been overlooked. In just the European theater alone, bodies were scattered over 1.5 million miles of territory. And in the Pacific, the bodies of dead American soldiers were spread out across innumerable jungle islands. The GRS men nonetheless diligently scoured both theaters of war for the dead, and in 1946 the government authorized the return of the bodies at the government's expense for proper burial at home. This program would eventually cost $191 million, but that would allow for the families of 170,000 fallen soldiers to bury their loved ones in home burial plots inside the U.S. The recovery of the dead after a major battle is a gruesome yet necessary affair. The existence of units like the Graves Registration Service and the incredible lengths they went to in order to ensure the recovery and proper burial of so many dead soldiers, however, speaks to a strange dichotomy of human nature. On one hand, we invest millions of dollars into weapons that allow us to take life with greater and greater efficacy, and on the other hand, we also spend millions on the recovery of the dead in order to honor the life they once had. If aliens ever arrived on Earth, they'd probably think we were crazy, and we'd be hard-pressed to dispute it.
World War I officially started on July 28, 1914, and ended on November 11, 1918. The number of casualties differs depending on what source you read, and finding exact numbers is of course impossible. It's generally thought this devastating war involving multiple nations ended with about 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. 10 million of those deaths were civilian deaths, and 9.7 million of them were military personnel. It's said the Entente powers, also called the Allies, lost around 5.7 million soldiers, and the Central powers lost somewhere in the region of 4 million. As the Robert Schuman Center tells us, many of the overall deaths were not related to actual fighting, but to famine, disease, and genocide. Welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show, 50 Shocking Facts About World War I. Number 50, the Allies. Before we talk about details many of our viewers might not know, we have to spend a bit of time on the basics. Who was involved, for instance? Well, it started with Austria-Hungary and Serbia declaring war on each other. Soon after, other countries got involved. As we already said, there were the Allies and the Central Powers. The main allies were the French Republic, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire. Italy changed sides and joined the Allies. The USA declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. These were the main players on the Allied side, but backing them up were the countries of Belgium, Brazil, Greece, Montenegro, Romania, Japan, and Serbia. Please note that we have stated empires, which consisted of various other nations. If you go to the Cook Islands, you'll find a memorial with a list of its soldiers that fell in the war. Or you can look at a similar list of people who came from India and died in the war, and it's a very long one. For instance, 1.4 million Indians served, while 629,000 Canadians did. The empire where the sun never set was vast. Number 49. The Central Powers. The Central Powers' main players were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Then there were what were called co-belligerents and German client states. The main co-belligerents were the Dervish State, a Somali Muslim kingdom, the South African Republic, and the Sultanate of Darfur. Number 48. Who died? It's said that Germany mobilized 13,250,000 soldiers. 66% of them ended up as casualties, and 1.8 million of them ended up injured or in the ground. Over 20 million Russians served, and around 11.8 million, or 56% of them, died or got injured. These numbers are highly disputed. 6.2 million Brits went to war, and 886,000 of them didn't come back. 41% of those Brits died or were hurt in the war. The French sent 8.4 million people to war, and 1.4 million soldiers died. 67% of French soldiers were injured or died. The USA sent 4.3 million soldiers to war, and 53,000 of them didn't come back. 5.9% of American soldiers were hurt or died. 74,000 Indians from almost 1.5 million soldiers died in the war. 650,000 Italians from over 5.6 million soldiers died. 62,000 Australian soldiers died, and 65,000 Canadians died. Romania was also badly hit, with 250,000 of its soldiers not coming back from the war. It was almost the same situation for Serbia, which lost 275,000 soldiers. We can't go through every country, unfortunately, as it would just take too long, but these countries suffered the worst in terms of military losses. The USA also suffered in an entirely original way, but we are keeping that fact for the number 1 spot. Number 47, a chain reaction. Okay, now that we have some of those basic facts over with, let's talk about more obscure things. Some people say one man was the catalyst for the beginning of the war. His name was Gavrilo Princip, the Bosnian Serb who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife. He said after he was arrested, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be freed from Austria." He obviously had no idea this would start a war, and then a world war. Number 46, always read the use-by date. After the assassination, Mr. Princip didn't fancy a life in jail, so he swallowed a cyanide pill. However, this only made him feel sick because it said the pill was out of date. The 19-year-old also tried to shoot himself, but his gun was taken from him. Talk about an ill-starred life. He was then sent to prison, where conditions were so awful he got very sick, lost a limb, and died looking not much different from a skeleton. Number 45. Trenches. So you probably know this already, but much of the war was fought in trenches. On the Western Front, you had many of these things, and millions of soldiers lived in them. Sometimes the opposing armies were not even that far apart, with the space between them being called no man's land. Of that space, one historian writes, on the Western Front, it was typically between 100 and 300 yards, though only 30 yards on Vimy Ridge. Number 44. Trench feet. Standing inside dirty, muddy, often rain-soaked trenches was hard on the feet, or you could say soft on the feet. Many soldiers developed what became known as trench foot. You could also call it zombie foot, as that is what it might look like. Sometimes it would become gangrenous and the foot would have to be amputated. Number 43, dogs. The British love their dogs, and during the war, some people in the UK donated their canines to the war effort. Dogs could run around the battlefield and carry messages, and they were hard to shoot. Smaller dogs were also great at catching rats in the trenches. Believe it or not, there were what was called casualty dogs. These dogs would run around the battlefield with medical supplies tied to them so injured soldiers could be helped. They were like little four-legged ambulances. Number 42, Jackie. South African soldiers took a baboon to France to help out. Its name was Jackie and it had a uniform. Number 41, dead fish. Goldfish were also employed, or we should say sacrificed. They were used to test the water that had been used to wash gas masks. If the fish died, those masks needed a better washing. Number 40, a stairway to hell. The Brits used to hate German Zeppelins, which are kind of rigid airships that would fly over Britain. They killed about 500 people in the UK, and the British public certainly didn't like the sight of them. The first ever Zeppelin attack by Germany on Britain happened at Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn in January 1915. By the end of the war, the Brits had become pretty good at shooting them down, destroying 77 of the 115 airships of the German Zeppelin fleet. Number 39, British men. When the war began, there were just 350,000 soldiers in the British Army. That number became millions when conscription was introduced in 1916. That meant that if you were a bloke aged 18 to 41 and in decent health, off to war you went. Number 38, I'm not going. Some people just refused to fight. Many of those people may have had an inkling of the utter carnage that was taking place on the front lines while higher-ups were busy moving plastic figures over a map. Others were pacifists because of their religious beliefs. Those that refused to go were called conscientious objectors, and it's believed there were 16,000 of them in the UK. One man writes, "I looked him straight in the eye and told him, I said, I respectfully refuse to obey your orders. And he went barmy. Absolutely barmy." Barmy means crazy, if you didn't know already. Not many Brits use this word nowadays. Number 37, Dear Bertrand. British philosopher Bertrand Russell was a conscientious objector. "I never believed so frightful a thing could happen. It is utter madness for us to join this war," said Russell. This very intelligent man was well aware of what scheming is often behind wars and the propaganda countries use to send their men to die. Russell said the public needed to think harder about war, stating, "The force that in the long run makes for peace and all other things is reason, the power of thinking against instinct." He wasn't keen on American war policies either later in his life. He died at the ripe old age of 97. Number 36. It was the Germans who first used the flamethrower in the war, and their scary machines could fire flames 130 feet. Historians wrote that the Flammenwerfer terrified British soldiers. Number 35. Tank sex. The British had male and female tanks in the war. Male tanks had 2 6-pounder guns and 3 303 Hotchkiss machine guns, while female tanks had 1 Hotchkiss and 4 Vickers machine guns. Number 34, Mexico Go. The Brits intercepted a German telegraph in 1917. It was a message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's minister in Mexico. It said, "Please invade the USA." The Brits didn't tell the USA about the message at first. They waited for a better time instead. The Brits thought if America was going to get involved, there had to be a perfect moment to show the country that it was almost invaded. Number 33, PTSD. Imagine what it would be like seeing half your friends being killed. This kind of warfare is unimaginable to people today. Many soldiers returned home and became what people have called a quiet man. In the army, there wasn't much sympathy, and if men suffered psychologically, they were often called weak. Number 32, How Do You Really Feel? We found this excerpt from a book written after the war about the mental state of some men that came back. It says that some of those men suffered loss of memory, insomnia, terrifying dreams, pains, emotional instability, diminution of self-confidence and self-control, attacks of unconsciousness or of changed consciousness, sometimes accompanied by convulsive movements resembling those characteristic of epileptic fits, incapacity to understand any but the simplest matters, obsessive thoughts, usually of the gloomiest and most painful kind, even, in some cases, hallucinations and incipient delusions. It also states that these symptoms make life for some of their victims a veritable hell. Number 31, no shocks please. Sigmund Freud didn't like the fact that many of these suffering men were given electric shock therapy, which basically meant destroying their brains. Freud wrote that war neuroses were best treated with psychoanalysis, not shocks. Number 30, military men don't get neuroses. The military fought back against all these intellectuals, saying war could ruin a man physically and psychologically. One military man wrote, "War neuroses, which persists, is not a credible disease to have, as it indicates in practically every case a lack of the soldierly qualities which have distinguished the Allied armies. No one should be permitted to glorify himself as a case of shell shock." Shell shock was exactly what it sounds like, a kind of PTSD before the expression was created. Number 29, 6th place. It's generally thought that the First World War was the 6th deadliest of modern wars. Number 28, Chinese warriors. Maybe the deadliest war of all time was the Three Kingdoms War in China that lasted 60 years from 220 to 280. It's thought as many as 40 million people died. The Mongol invasions killed almost that number. Number 27, letters to the front. 12 million letters were delivered to the Western Front every week. It took them 2 days to get there from the UK. Number 26, plastic faces. It was this war that more or less started the work of plastic surgeons, as so many people lost bits of their faces and other body parts. One soldier described what happened to his face in the war. "I could feel something lying loosely in my left cheek, as though I had a chicken bone in my mouth. It was, in reality, half my jaw, which had been broken off, teeth and all, and was floating about in my mouth." Number 25, banks of blood. The first ever blood bank was set up in 1917 on the Western Front. Number 24, the mess of Gallipoli. 58,000 soldiers died at the bloody Battle of Gallipoli, a move thought up by Winston Churchill to bring down Germany's ally, Ottoman Turkey. Australia's ex-prime minister once said this battle left horrific scars and was, in a critical sense, our nation's baptism of fire, and 8,000 Australians didn't come back. 87,000 Ottoman Turkish troops also died. Number 23, Old Siam. It's said one of the countries hardly anyone knew joined the war was Thailand. 19 Thai soldiers died of accident and disease, although in those days they were called Siamese, as the country was called Siam. The soldiers fought on the side of the Allies. Number 22, poetry, not pain relief. People wear poppies to commemorate war because of a poem written about World War I. That poem is called In Flanders Fields. This is one stanza. "We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields." Number 21, no food. The British had such a big food shortage that the government banned feeding pigeons and people throwing rice at weddings. Number 20, fake Paris. During the war, the French built a fake Paris to fool German bombers. The Telegraph writes, "A second Paris, complete with a Champs-Élysées and Gare du Nord, was built towards the end of the First World War to fool German bombers." The fake city was very much a secret and it was never fully finished or tested. Number 19, we speak no English here, dude. Did you know that before World War I, German was the second most widely spoken language in the USA, but was forcibly suppressed because of the war? Number 18, Germans were treated badly in America. During the war, all Germans in America were forced to carry registration cards at all times after they had registered at the post office. NPR writes that the US wanted to get rid of all things German, saying, during World War I, US government propaganda erased German culture. The Huffington Post also states that 2,048 Germans living in America were arrested and forced to live in internment camps. Number 17, ban on sausages. During the war, Germany put a ban on eating sausages. 250,000 cow intestines were used to make just one Zeppelin, so intestines were in demand. Number 16, fake news. The British wanted America to get involved in the war, so it decided one way to do that was to write some fake news to get Americans emotional and harbor some anti-German sentiments. They had journalist John R. Ratham write reports that were later said to be fraudulent. According to Time magazine, his motto was raise hell and sell papers. Other media reports that his false reports stirred up anger against many innocent Germans living in the US. Number 15, Native Americans. It's said about 13,000 Native Americans fought in the war. Number 14, the native tongue. Germans were always breaking codes, and it was hard to come up with something to beat that. After hearing two native Choctaw soldiers talking, one American officer realized that the Germans would never understand this strange language. The BBC writes, "The Choctaw Telephone Squad was born. It said this band of men were instrumental in winning many battles." Number 13, clever birds. It's thought that about 500,000 pigeons carried messages during the war. Some of them were sent to the front line by parachute. One such message we found read, "On water attacked by 3 Huns. Huns were Germans. Don't ever call pigeons pests again." Number 12, the return of the hawks. The Germans didn't much like how the British used those clever birds, so the German army trained hawks to kill the pigeons. Number 11, the Sorry Somme. The worst battle in British history was at the Battle of the Somme. Some 60,000 British men died in just one day. It's said more than 1 million British, French, and German troops were killed or injured. 465,000 to 600,000 were German, 350,000 were British, and 204,000 were French. Soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa, and Canada also died. One German officer once wrote, "Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a ghastlier word." Number 10, genocide. It's said that during the war, the Turks slaughtered around 1.5 million Armenians. Robbery and rape were also common. This is known as the Armenian Holocaust. Number 9, Silent Night. Time magazine writes, "On a crisp, clear morning 100 years ago, thousands of British, Belgian, and French soldiers put down their rifles, stepped out of their trenches, and spent Christmas mingling with their German enemies along the Western Front." Stories differ, but it's generally thought about 100,000 soldiers had a truce on Christmas Day, singing hymns and even playing football in no man's land. One British soldier wrote, "First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours." Number 8, new nations. After the war, independent nations emerged. They were Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Number 7, big guns. In 1917, the Germans pulled out what was at the time the biggest gun in the world. It looked more like a house than a gun, and it could fire shells up to 31 miles. Its name was Lang Max, which meant Long Max. Number 6, rape of Belgium. The Germans marched into Belgium, and all hell broke loose. They killed and plundered, but it wasn't as bad as how the British media portrayed the invasion. The Brits compared German soldiers to serial killer Jack the Ripper. Nonetheless, things were pretty bad. 18,296 children became war orphans. So yes, it was bad, but not as bad as the Brits made it out. Fake news isn't new by any means. Number 5, mud bath. Some sources say that the mud at times was so thick that some soldiers disappeared in it. By the way, trenches were given names such as Death Valley. In all, 25,000 miles of trenches were dug. Number 4, famous soldiers. Who fought in the war? The Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien was one famous person. Harry S. Truman was also there, and so was Mr. Adolf Hitler. Walt Disney tried to sign up, but was rejected because of his young age. He did, however, end up driving ambulances in France. Number 3, lots of love, your dearest son. War was horrible, and letters home to families can be harrowing to read. One man wrote, "Just a line to let you know that I got the fags, or cigarettes, on Tuesday. I thank you very much for sending them. They have stopped the weekend passes as there are a lot of absences, but I shall ask the captain for permission to come on a pass. We are going to the front on the 19th of November. Dear mother, do not worry about me, for by God's help I shall come home well." He died soon after he wrote that letter, according to the Telegraph. Here's another letter. This is what they call the Somme. Up to the neck in mud and water, shells flying everywhere. That was from a Brit called Grimshaw. We are not sure what happened to him. Number 2, British seamen write the best letters. Because of the Freedom of Information Act, we know that a man called Mansfield Smith Cumming did something original when he served in the Secret Service during the war. Apparently, he discovered that semen, or sperm, made great invisible ink, and like other invisible inks, it was impossible to find with chemicals. Mr. Cumming wrote, "Now every man has his own stylo." Okay, we know this sounds a bit like fake news, but Britain's Telegraph backs the story up, stating, "British intelligence services experimented with using semen as an invisible ink to write top-secret letters. Now you know how to send secret letters to your lover. Use your man juice." Number 1, no condoms for Americans. It seems the USA was the only country not to give its soldiers condoms for their time served during the war. It's also said that thousands of American soldiers returned home with STDs. The Huffington Post writes an estimated 400,000 military men were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. Those Yank soldiers were very popular in those days with European girls. Apparently, the British also didn't give condoms to its forces at the start, but changed that policy quite quickly. Perhaps with all that terrible destruction going on, one solace to soldiers was wanting to create a new life.
The unthinkable has happened, and military forces clash on land, in the air, and on the sea, and underneath it, in the most violent war to date. But what would actually happen after World War III? The probability of a third world war is negligible but not impossible. All three of these big military powers who have the capability to launch a global war all have too much to lose by doing so. But history is full of examples of small conflicts spiraling completely out of control and beyond the plans of those who initiated them. To find out what the world would look like after World War III, we have to examine two different global wars, a conventional war and a nuclear war. One thing is for sure, the economic damage alone would reshape the face of the Earth. Such a war would inevitably begin by a confrontation between US and Chinese forces in the South or East China Sea. A Sino-US war isn't likely to go global and would require multiple escalatory steps to get there. First, China would have to directly threaten or attack Japanese forces, something that is predisposed to do already because of the presence of multiple US air bases in Japan. If China wanted to keep Japan out of the conflict, it would have to avoid striking these bases, which would have seriously detrimental effects on its ability to fight against the US. Next, a third party would have to be willing to exploit the situation to its own advantage. The most likely culprits here are India, Iran, and Russia. India would be tempted to act to push Chinese ground forces out of the contested northern border regions and perhaps even maneuver itself to throw China out of Tibet, thus threatening Chinese freshwater supplies and granting it massive leverage over its rival. That's unlikely but not impossible, as a Sino-American war would largely be fought at the sea and in the air, leaving the People's Liberation Army free to fight against Indian incursion. Iran, however, is likely to exploit the diversion of US forces from the region for its own gain. A war between the US and China would inevitably cause a drawdown of US peacekeeping forces in other regions of the world. Currently, 60% of US firepower is in the Pacific, but as losses rapidly mount, the US will need to pull reinforcements from its multiple other global commands. With American forces no longer acting as police against bad actors, Iran could use the opportunity to attack Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states with its superior military. This would hugely disrupt global oil trade and have devastating financial repercussions across the world. Russia might seek to exploit US preoccupation with China for its own gain in Europe. While Russia has no ambition to rule all of Europe, it could see a drawdown of US forces in Europe as the opportunity to take by force breakaway Soviet republics and even some of its NATO neighbors such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In a worst-case scenario, all three flashpoints are ignited due to American preoccupation with China, leaving the world dramatically different after the war. Such a war is almost certain to end with a US victory over China, although an extremely costly and poorly defined victory. Immediately at war's end, the United States military would be severely depleted, going from the world's most powerful fighting force to a significantly weakened force that still has global reach, but will take a decade or more to restore itself to its former glory. American naval and air losses would be staggering, as with much of half of its air and naval fleets destroyed. Half of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet would be sunk in a conflict with China, a loss of over $50 billion in ship costs alone, over 500 aircraft and over 12,000 seamen and aviators. The loss of all important American carriers alone would see the United States lose its ability to rapidly respond to global conflicts. This loss in capability would only be compounded by significant losses in the U.S. Air Force. Without the ability to rapidly and overwhelmingly respond to global crises, the immediate post-war years would see an ignition of regional wars across Africa and the Middle East. Critics of U.S. military presence around the world would rapidly see the cost of losing that peacekeeping force as simmering tensions suddenly explode in the absence of a threat of U.S. involvement. In the Middle East, Iran would seize the opportunity to attack its longtime rival Saudi Arabia. Despite being an oil-rich and wealthy nation, Saudi Arabia is handily outclassed militarily by Iran, as it has relied on the United States to keep Iran in check for decades. No other power is likely to prevent Iranian aggression in the Middle East, nor do they have the capability to do so. All European powers, save for France, simply no longer have the expeditionary capabilities to respond to military conflicts around the world without U.S. support, and France lacks the assets needed to significantly counter Iranian aggression so far from its own shores. An oil-rich Iran would become a regional superpower, shaping the Middle Eastern policy to its own liking. This would inevitably lead to an explosion of extremism, with waves of attacks against Europe and African nations, launching both continents into a dark age of terrorism. Enriched by Saudi Arabian wealth and oil fields, Iran could continue a campaign of conquest unchecked across the Middle East, forcing other neighboring nations into its fold and simply invading those that resisted. With its finger firmly on the oil tap to Europe, Iran would have great influence over European powers, likely leading to a necessary buildup of military forces in Europe and an inevitable invasion of the Middle East years later. A European Middle East war would be a world war in its own right, with staggering casualties on all sides and economically ruinous for both regions. Middle East turmoil would only make the lives of those in China worse. In the aftermath of a war against the US, the Chinese Navy and Air Force would be obliterated, with only those forces left in reserve in Western China against India or Russian incursions left intact. Chinese infrastructure, at least along its eastern Pacific border, would also suffer moderate damage due to American long-range air attacks, while China can do little to militarily threaten the US homeland. Large-scale damage to Chinese port facilities would only exuberate the damage caused by years of American naval blockade. China relies on the Pacific for the majority of its trade, and most importantly for the import of energy resources. Despite heavy losses, the US Navy could still undertake an effective blockade of Chinese trade, crippling the nation and resulting in a GDP loss of as much as 35%. China, in return, could threaten US trade in the Pacific as well, but would be unable to directly threaten either the American West or East Coast, resulting in only an expected GDP loss of 10% for the US. But the disruption of trade in what's the world's most important trade superhighway would only result in the weakening of the East Asian economies and, to a smaller extent, the entire world. East Asian nations would be the hardest hit due to their dependence on Chinese goods. This will have a knock-on effect on European nations who import cheap goods manufactured in East Asia. The ensuing worldwide economic recession will lead to flare-ups in social unrest and widespread unemployment. This, combined with a worst-case scenario of Iranian aggression in the Middle East, could set the stage for revolutionary movements in some countries and the flare-up of partisan tension spilling over into outright violence. Perhaps no nation would be as rocked, though, as China, who, despite inflicting incredible losses on the US military, would still be facing a humiliating defeat, with a near total loss of its Navy and Air Force. American cyber warfare operations would work to steadily degrade the Chinese government's ability to censor information electronically throughout the nation, and increasing unrest and war weariness would embolden pro-democracy and separatist factions in China. While it's likely that the Chinese government would remain intact, this would represent a significant threat to the Chinese Communist Party, directly leading to even more violent crackdowns on an increasingly rebellious population. We've already seen this scenario in miniature thanks to the Hong Kong riots, and while China showed restraint in Hong Kong because of international pressure, it's unlikely to show restraint when faced with similar uprisings within the mainland when the survival of the CCP is threatened. The further disruption of the Chinese economy would have a domino effect on the rest of the world, especially those nations that rely on China for critical technology and imports. Global GDP would shrink significantly, leading to unemployment and unrest across the world. While the rest of the world is suffering, though, one nation might come out of a third world war smelling like roses. Russia has long suffered under a weakening economy, made worse by European sanctions due to its aggression in Crimea. However, the loss of Chinese trade routes throughout the war and a need by China to replace its destroyed military equipment would be a massive financial boon to the state. European powers might be even willing to lift sanctions against Russia and provide economic concessions or even political ones, such as allowing Russia to reabsorb former Soviet republics in exchange for the aid of the Russian military in fighting against Iranian aggression in the Middle East. A new global order after World War III would see Russia rising to a position of prominence it hasn't held since the days of the Soviet Union. But now let's look at a worst-case scenario: complete and total nuclear warfare that spans the face of the Earth. While a conventional World War III would still see the United States suffer the least militarily or economic harm, a nuclear war would almost completely level the playing field between China and the US, leaving both nations a ruined, smoking wreck. The US still holds the advantage in number and sophistication of nuclear weapons, thus China would inevitably suffer far greater damage than the US. However, nearly every major US city would suffer at least one nuclear strike, with most coming under fire from multiple warheads. Should Russia join the fray, it would inevitably pull in nuclear NATO members such as France and Great Britain, and spread thermonuclear warfare across 4 of the world's 7 continents. Previous fears of nuclear winter have since been proven to be overblown, but a global cooling effect will still take place, dropping global temperatures by a few degrees. A drop of just 1 degree centigrade in global temperatures would make Canadian wheat growing impossible, showing us just how vulnerable the global food supply really is. What farmland isn't rendered fallow by a drop in global temperatures would likely be unusable due to nuclear impacts. Both the US and Russia target each other's vast swaths of farmland as nuclear targets, with the express intent of starving each each other into submission in case of nuclear war. With the US alone exporting much of the world's grain, it wouldn't just be the Americans that starve, but much of the world as well. Compound that with strikes against Russia and Chinese food-producing regions, plus contamination from other nuclear strikes, and hundreds of millions would begin to starve within weeks. The initial casualties would also be in the hundreds of millions, with hundreds of millions more falling prey to injuries and radiation sickness within days to weeks. Then, secondary effects of global nuclear war would lead to even more deaths, as trade routes are disrupted, infrastructure is rendered inoperable, and diseases caused by high concentration of airborne debris strike down people by the millions. Many nations around the world would rely on imports to feed their populations, and the loss of global trade alone would doom tens of millions to immediate starvation. As massive plumes of choking dust and debris spread across countrysides in Australia, North America, Europe, and Asia, respiratory disease would claim millions more. Global firestorms would decimate wildlands, as fires ignited by burning cities spread for hundreds of miles around, causing fires so fast that they'd be visible from space, if not for all the debris in the atmosphere. If one could peer through that thick haze of gray that would remain aloft for days or even weeks, they would see a planet in flames, with fires raging for weeks or even months and killing millions more. The world population would likely fall to below 1 billion within 5 years of global thermonuclear war. Within a decade of starvation, disease, and conflict for dwindling resources, humanity would be lucky to number in the 500 millions. However, there is good reason to think that humanity would not go extinct after all, and could even bounce back in time. Most nuclear strikes are designed to maximize destruction. A ground burst of nuclear weapon severity limits its destructive range, as most of the energy in the explosion is sent down into the ground or absorbed by ground features such as buildings, hills, etc. Therefore, nuclear weapons are designed to explode over their target, greatly enhancing their lethality and avoiding ground clutter altogether. While this makes nuclear weapons more lethal, it has the positive side effect of sending more of the resulting radiation upwards and into space. Fears of a global irradiated wasteland might be overblown, and while it's certain that radioactive debris would be in harmful levels just about anywhere on Earth, humanity and the livestock and food crops it depends on could still survive in sufficient numbers to eventually bounce back. That's because the fissile material in a bomb is destroyed in milliseconds, causing an intense burst of radioactivity that quickly falls off as atoms decay in a chain reaction. In several years, most radioactive fallout would turn into more stable elements, such as strontium-90. With its half-life of 29 years, strontium-90 and similar materials are still harmful, but not nearly as radioactive as materials with a half-life of hours, minutes, or even seconds. As Nagasaki and Hiroshima have proven, it doesn't take long for humanity to reclaim the ruins of cities struck by nuclear weapons. The real danger is in the sheer number of weapons employed in a global nuclear war, and thus the higher concentration of less dangerous but still harmful, longer-lived radioactive isotopes in the water and soil. Human lifespans will be shortened dramatically, and many species will go extinct due to climate change, natural ecosystems will collapse, and a staggering amount of pollution will be created by the incineration of hundreds of major cities. Even after all of that, within centuries, humanity should be well on the rebound. What shape the world would take, however, is completely unknown, though it's likely that none of the current major powers would continue to exist as cohesive states. In all likelihood, it would be Africa which would become the lotus of economic and military power, as it's least likely to be directly affected by nuclear war, and unlike the rest of the world, they'd still be able to feed most of their population, as many African states have agrarian-based economies. One thing is certain, the nations that launched World War III would not be much more than dust, and utterly inconsequential in the new era of human history to come. World War II is undoubtedly the deadliest and most brutal conflict this world has ever seen. Even if massive battles with millions of casualties, genocide, and the mass suffering of hundreds of millions of people were not enough, there were various weapons employed by all sides that magnified the carnage by an immeasurable magnitude. Ethics aside, these weapons are included in this list due to their known ability to cause damage, with a list of theoretical weapons reserved for another time. What makes any particular one of these weapons so terrifying is either through the suffering they caused victims, their effectiveness on the battlefield, or their ability to defeat countermeasures. But without further ado, here are some of the most terrifying weapons of World War II: kamikazes. As the war in the Pacific turned ever worse for Japan, they turned to increasingly desperate measures to stem the tide of the American Navy. Though all sides had undertaken suicide missions by individual pilots in the war to some extent, the Japanese were the ones to employ this horrifying tactic regularly. In October 1944, the American and Allied navies began to face an enemy deadlier than any other encountered before. The premise behind a kamikaze attack was simple: load an aircraft with as many bombs and explosives as possible, find a high-value target like an aircraft carrier, and keep going until you hit it. Though it might seem that kamikazes would have been easy to defeat, you would surely be mistaken. In conventional air attacks, if the flak is too heavy or too many enemy aircraft approaching, pilots concerned with preserving their lives would break off and return to base. This was not the case for kamikazes. What made these men so terrifying was not only the weapon they piloted at US ships at hundreds of miles an hour, but their training before even stepping into the cockpit. Though most of the early kamikazes were already experienced veterans, most of the ones that flew later on were raw recruits, receiving little flight training. These men instead went through intensive religious and ideological classes to further increase their conviction for the cause. That way, by the time they took off for that final time, they were more determined than ever to deliver their deadly payload. Even though the US did develop tactics such as increasing air patrols, building defense in depth with picket ships, and developing better time-delayed fuses, kamikaze attacks were still devastating. During their debut in the Pacific Theater, kamikazes obliterated an American task force, steaming for the Philippines, sinking 7 ships and damaging another 40. These attacks would continue with intensity through the Battle of Okinawa, which saw 36 ships sunk, 386 damaged, and almost 5,000 sailors killed, making it the deadliest battle of the war for the US Navy. The Shoe Mine 42. Mines are a great way to deter enemy movement or funnel them into areas where you could bring pre-planned fire on them. They're also an excellent delaying tactic since it forces an advancing enemy to slow down to carefully prod for these devices, since unlike most other mines, the Germans made these mines out of wood. As its name would imply, the Shoe Mine was an anti-personnel mine that the German army first developed in 1942. Due to the increasing number of ways to detect and destroy mines, they wanted something that Allied troops could not detect. Additionally, due to the wartime shortages of metal, the Germans wanted to conserve as much as possible. With millions of these mines being produced, the cost savings proved significant for the German war machine. But where the mine really paid off was the fear brought into the hearts of Allied soldiers, hoping not to step on them. The Shoe Mine was not designed to be an extremely large or complex mine. It was composed of a simple wooden box with a detonator and some explosives. Its primary purpose was to maim soldiers, and the war diaries and official records of Allied troops can attest to their effectiveness. Due to their small size and inability to be detected with a metal detector, the only surefire way to identify these little buggers would be to probe the ground with a knife or bayonet manually. However, such methods proved impractical when the Germans placed them on roads or other areas that Allied troops had to cross under fire. Not wanting to be defeated, some Allied troops came up with ingenious methods to defeat them. The British, for example, came up with an idea of placing a garden roller with metal spikes on the end of it. A brave volunteer would kit up in an early version of a bomb suit and roll this contraption across the battlefield. Whenever it hit a mine, it would blow up and the soldier would keep moving on to the next one. Though this design was eventually not approved for broader use by General Montgomery, it's an excellent example of how such a simple device could defeat every advanced detection system the Allies possessed, causing fear and casualties in its wake. Despite lacking official bodies of research from contemporary accounts, troops noted that this mine, along with the vaunted MG-42 and Screaming Meanie Nebelwerfer guns, were chief among their least favorite things to encounter on the battlefield. US submarines. German U-boats get a lot of credit for World War II, and rightfully so. They sunk almost 15 million tons worth of war material and sent tens of thousands of sailors down to an early watery grave. However, even though U-boats are more famously known during the war, it was actually the US submarine force that was much more feared, and for a good reason. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the first units that struck back were US submarines. President Roosevelt ordered that a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare would be brought against the Japanese, and the service gladly obliged the order. Pretty soon, without warning, Japanese naval and merchant vessels were being sent to the bottom at an alarming rate. US submarines were so successful at attacking Japanese shipping that by the end of 1944, most submarine commanders reported patrols were increasingly difficult, not due necessarily to enemy action, but due to a loss of targets to shoot. This sentiment can be seen in the data for Japanese merchant shipping losses, with over 8.5 million tons of shipping sunk. Those figures mean that the entire Japanese merchant marine was sunk almost twice over, compared to its starting tonnage at the beginning of the war. Not only did the Japanese Navy and merchant marines fear US submarines, but also their army. During the war, historians have estimated that over 44 Japanese troop ships were sunk, with over 33 of those causing over 1,000 deaths. Some of the troop ships, such as the sinking of the Toyama Maru, resulted in the deaths of over 5,000 soldiers. In total, tens of thousands of Japanese troops were killed at sea, and the threat posed by submarines was so bad, top army commanders were unsure if they'd be able to reinforce their far-flung Pacific outposts. If sinking the entire Japanese merchant fleet, helping cripple the Japanese Navy, and preventing the Japanese army from moving were not terrifying enough, another way that submarines caused even more suffering was through their blockade of Japan. Since so many merchant ships were sunk and so many had to delay their journeys days or weeks to get into Japan, the civilian population suffered immensely. Because Japan is an island nation, it relies solely on imports of raw materials, food, and fuel from abroad to keep it going. However, because of the constant attacks by U.S. submarines, the Japanese war economy greatly suffered, and the blockade was the main cause for every type of shortage possible in Japan. U.S. commanders would remark after the war that U.S. submarines were the most critical weapon at disabling the Japanese economy and war effort. Sarin gas. While many people might be familiar with sarin gas from its use in modern-day war zones in the Middle East, the Germans actually invented it in 1938. During their research to design a better pesticide to kill weevils, German scientist Gerhard Schrader found it created a combination far too deadly for some afternoon gardening when he mixed phosphorus with cyanide. A loyal Nazi, Gerhard took his findings to the German military, who quickly embraced the concoction. After rigorous testing, the military produced around 30,000 tons of the stuff. The sarin gas was then weaponized by putting it on specially designed artillery shells that could hurl the deadly gas at advancing Allied troops. Despite having it available since the beginning of the war, and against his general's urgings to use it, Hitler probably made the only correct decision in his life by not employing the weapon. Though conspiracy theories abound as to why Hitler never used it, especially as he knew the war was lost and had nothing to lose, the matter is probably more pragmatic than someone would think. Many people claim that due to his survival of a poison gas attack in the First World War, he was scarred for life and refused to use it on other people. As anyone with any knowledge of the Holocaust would know, he had no problems using deadly cyanide against millions of victims. Rather, it's likely he believed that doing so would result in a massive retaliation against his military, which, especially with the war going on the way it was, it probably was something he didn't want to risk. For the Allies, it was definitely good that he never chose to employ sarin gas in combat. Sarin gas is a terrible chemical weapon and kills by essentially blocking the nerves in your muscles from speaking with your brain. As a result, you begin to convulse and essentially suffocate to death since your muscles need more oxygen than your body will provide. Additionally, it was in the Allies' favor since when the American and British troops captured stockpiles of the weapon at the end of the war, they had no idea what it even was, much less being able to provide effective countermeasures against it. So even though it never was employed in action, this weapon definitely ranks among the most terrifying weapons of the war due to its potential to be used. Unit 731 biological attacks. The human experiments and torturous murder of tens of thousands of prisoners are widely known and studied in this infamous weapons facility. Though Unit 731's main complex in northern China has garnered the most attention in Western literature, a little known yet even more terrifying aspect of its methods includes an organized biological weapons campaign designed to defeat the Chinese people. With the war in China raging for over 5 years, by 1941, the Japanese army was looking for ways to turn the tide of the war and crush stubborn Chinese resistance facing them. By this time, the Japanese army had already proved that they viewed Chinese soldiers and civilians as less than human and would resort to any means necessary to defeat them. When researchers with Unit 731 approached army officials with their plans to test a variety of diseases to see which ones were the most effective at causing a pandemic, they happily obliged. After choosing various diseases such as cholera, bubonic plague, typhoid, anthrax, botulism, and dysentery, Unit 731 decided to run live test trials of the effects of these deadly diseases by employing them against the civilian population. Throughout the course of 1941, no fewer than 11 Chinese cities were devastated by these diseases, as they killed tens of thousands and sickened hundreds of thousands more, either through dropping specially made porcelain bombs, crop dusting with aircraft, poisoning water supplies, or purposefully infecting food and clothing headed towards civilian population centers. The Japanese scientists proved their ability to bring biological destruction against their enemies. The army was more than pleased with the results of these tests and soon ordered detachments of scientists and specially trained army personnel to be distributed throughout their forces in China to be used against the Chinese military as well. Though there were many such attacks throughout the war in China, perhaps one of the deadliest and most terrifying was the May 1942 biological attack on Baoshan. Situated near the border with Burma, this area of southeastern China was vital for the Japanese military to control in order to prevent resupply of Chinese forces in the region from the south. After the successful test trials of 1941, the Army wanted to start conducting biological warfare operations in conjunction with its conventional military attacks. Between May 4th to May 6th, 1942, the city was bombarded by tons of munitions from Japanese planes, to include numerous bombs filled with disease-ridden flies. Additionally, troops from Unit 731 poisoned local water supplies with cholera. The Japanese hoped that after the successful assault on the city, the remaining civilians would flee to the countryside and infect their countrymen. To the surprise of the Japanese, it worked better than expected. Within weeks, a full-blown epidemic was ravaging southeastern China. Entire families were wiped out and villages were decimated. This area of China had never once had a recorded cholera outbreak, and this added to the suffering of those exposed who had no natural immunity to the disease. Because of this, by July, some estimates propose that over 200,000 people died. Even though data is scarce and death tolls from the attack range wildly, depending on defining the geographic location and time frame, this attack is still by far the deadliest single biological weapon attack of the war. Nuclear war. It's gonna happen, and you and everyone you know and love are going to die a horrible, terrible death, including your pets. Well, maybe it's not 100% for sure that the world will go up in nuclear flames, but for some people, having a bomb shelter is as necessary as having a kitchen. And if the worst comes to pass, it'll be them who are left laughing while we burn in a radioactive wasteland. Then, when the smoke clears, it'll be those prepared who rise up from their shelters to take back the world from the feral ghouls we've all become. But today, we're going to teach you how to avoid this horrible fate, because today, we're taking a look at how to build a bomb shelter. First, what are just a few of the ways a 1 megaton nuclear explosion can turn your day very, very bad? Well, in the first half of a second of a nuclear detonation, anyone caught looking in the direction of the blast and within a radius of up to 3 miles, depending on the yield of the bomb, will have their eyes seared by a blinding white light, resulting in permanent blindness. Anyone outside of this radius who happens to be looking in the direction of the blast may experience everything from temporary blindness to permanent vision loss. At the same time, ultraviolet light will sear all exposed flesh, instantly causing third-degree burns. In the next nanosecond, deadly gamma rays bombard the body and slam into cells, ripping them to shreds and penetrating deeper into the body. In the next nanosecond after that, the ambient air temperature has skyrocketed to thousands of degrees, though not yet as hot as it will very soon get. This dramatic spike in temperature immediately combusts all clothing, flesh, and other flammable objects. At the end of the first second, a heat wave resonating outwards from the explosion point will slam into everything within a half-mile to 3-mile radius, again depending on the yield of the bomb. With temperatures in excess of 540,032 degrees Fahrenheit, all flesh and flammable objects are immediately vaporized into atomic dust in the insane heat, and metal melts and pools along the ground. A shock wave then resonates out just behind the heat wave, crushing buildings and cars. If you're within a few miles of the blast, the shock wave can crush your chest cavity, and the superheated air shreds your lungs. Then, winds at speeds in excess of 400 miles per hour slam into anything left standing. And if you've somehow miraculously survived all the previous effects, you'll be Fusro-dad clear across a few city blocks. A dramatic change in air pressure crushes any remaining buildings, toppling them down into any survivors. For anyone not instantly killed or within the 3-mile death radius, those up to 7 miles away can suffer second to third degree burns, ruptured organs, and shattered eardrums. The intense heat can also make breathing so difficult that many will asphyxiate. The pulse of ultraviolet light generated by the blast can also sear flesh down to the bone, resulting in the need to amputate entire limbs for those who survive. Thankfully, victims will experience no pain from this, as the burning happens so quickly that pain nerves are destroyed before they can register the pain. For anyone up to 53 miles away, the flash of the explosion and its resulting temporary blindness would leave tens of thousands of drivers blind in an instant and result in thousands of deadly accidents. All technology within a potential radius of up to hundreds of miles would be instantly rendered useless, as electromagnetic radiation overloads the circuits inside and makes devices inoperable. Power grids across entire states would shut down and never be turned on again, requiring the total replacement of the complete power grid from the ground up. For weeks afterwards, radioactive fallout will pose a deadly risk for anyone within a few hundred miles of the blast site, especially if the explosion was a ground burst, which would kick up much more radioactive debris into the atmosphere. Those affected will die slow, lingering deaths as their DNA breaks down at the molecular level and infection and disease set in to eat their bodies alive. So, think you need a bomb shelter now? We thought so. Unfortunately, most people don't have the room to physically build a bomb shelter for themselves, as most people tend to live in densely populated cities where the living conditions are predominantly apartments. If this is the case for you, then all is not lost, and you can still successfully shelter in place long enough for the worst effects of a nuclear detonation to pass by. If stuck at home, you can dramatically increase your odds of survival by duct taping all of the windows, making sure that you seal any possible openings through which radioactive contaminants could leak in. If possible, you should head to the lowest level of an apartment building, such as a parking garage, though figuring out a way to stop the airflow in from big garage gates would be critical to survival. The deeper you can get, the better your odds of survival, though admittedly they're pretty slim as is already. But let's say you're one of the lucky ones and you have your own property and the ability to build whatever you want there, including a bomb shelter. Well, in that case, congratulations, because you'll soon be one of the last of humanity's survivors, fighting to retake Earth from hordes of deathclaws and super mutants. If you look online, you can find a variety of websites telling you how to build a good fallout shelter, but most of those require an extensive knowledge of construction and materials, as well as many thousands of dollars and specialized equipment. Today, we'll teach you how to build a fallout shelter that may be labor-intensive, but even the poorest vault dweller to be can afford. We hope you've got a shovel, because you're going to be doing a lot of digging. And remember, the infographic show is purely entertainment. First, you want to identify a suitable location for your fallout shelter. You ideally want to find somewhere semi-remote, but that you can realistically get to in time to save yourself from a nuclear bomb. With a 30-minute flight path from Russia to the US, you want to plan on having no more than 15 minutes travel distance from where you live to your shelter. But you also want to make sure there's no underground pipes or wires where you plan on building your shelter. Digging into one of these by accident can result in you getting drenched by fresh sewage, getting the electric shock of your life, or with a very hefty fine from your local city government. You need to call ahead to your town hall or local utility and inquire on the location of any underground infrastructure before you start digging to save you the pain and worries later. Now that you've chosen your spot, you're going to want to start digging downward at a fairly steep angle until you reach a depth of at least 12 to 15 feet. This is going to be your primary entry point into your shelter, though you'll end up building two. Next, you'll want to start digging straight ahead for approximately 3 to 4 feet, and then angle sharply up for another 3 to 4 feet. The end result will be an entry shaft that plunges down into the earth, levels off for a few feet, and then begins to rise up for a few feet again. The point of this is simple. Without expensive entryway materials and technology, you're going to have to rely on the same techniques that the Viet Cong used in Vietnam to protect your home under the ground from blast waves and water leaking in from the outside. Unlike in Vietnam though, the water that does leak down into your shelter will be radioactive, and so you want to create an area where the water can pool and soak into the ground without ever flooding your living space, hence the slope upwards. Your upward shaft should stop at a total depth of about 10 feet though, and this is because you'll need at minimum 3 feet of solid earth between you and the bomb above to protect you from the burst of gamma radiation. So at a depth of 10 feet, you'll be able to carve out a comfortable 7-foot ceiling shelter and maintain adequate overhead protection. You're not quite ready to start digging your living area though, as you have another major hazard to worry about in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion, and that's radioactive particles being carried by the wind. In order to protect yourself, you'll once more take inspiration from the Viet Cong, who built their tunnels to protect from napalm and a gas attack by American troops. At a depth of 10 feet, you'll want to dig straight a few feet, and then make a very sharp right turn, dig straight a few feet more, and make a very sharp left turn. Dig ahead a few feet and make another sharp left turn, and you've essentially made a U-bend in your tunnel. As wind from the outside rushes down into your shelter, the bend will severely weaken the strength of the blowing wind and help deposit the heavier radioactive dust and other particles on the floor before they reach you. To be safe though, you're going to repeat this construction one more time. So in total, your entry shaft should have 2 U-bends in it made up of very sharp right and left turns. Once those are complete, congratulations, because you're finally ready to start building your actual living area. Although we warn you, it's not going to be a palace. You'll want to make sure your shelter is as small as possible in order to keep it strong enough to withstand the initial blast. But you'll need at least 20 square feet per person who plans to inhabit the shelter for their personal needs and supplies. If you're handy, you can craft beds for everyone to occupy, but piles of blankets can make do in a pinch. You'll also want to make sure you have a toilet area which is easily accessible and can store a few weeks' worth of waste. An underground poop closet, if you will. The toilet should either be a shaft a few feet deep or a hole lined with plastic which can be sealed up and stored away until it can be safely disposed of later. It's not going to smell very nice in there, but better to breathe in your best friend's poop fumes than radioactive wind. Congratulations, you've built yourself a fallout shelter on a budget, which will give you a better than zero chance of survival. To top it off, you want to make sure you store at least 3 weeks worth of food and water, as this is when the danger of radioactive fallout is at its greatest. After this initial period, it should be safe enough to exit your shelter as long as you keep your skin covered and wear a breathing device. Most military surplus stores sell gas masks which are more than adequate at keeping out fine dust and other particles. You'll also want to line the entry point to the underground living area with many heavy blankets, creating layers of protection against any remaining wind that makes it past your double U-bends. You may not be living in luxury, nor living in the most secure bomb shelter ever made, but in your tiny self-made shelter, you'll have a far better chance of survival than us non-mole people too proud to dig for our lives. Then again, though, as with any fallout shelter owner, you really have to ask yourself one question. Is it worth surviving a global thermonuclear war? With climate change turning the Earth into a giant snowball for at least a few decades, and disease and starvation rampant, your odds of survival even after the bombs fall are nearly nil if the world decides to go all in on nuclear destruction. And that's before the global radiation superstorms that will poison every square inch of land and water on the planet. In our humble opinion, if the US and Russia decide to let loose with their hundreds of high-yield nuclear weapons, it's probably just best to step outside and perhaps call a few loved ones on your cell phone before it and you are atomic dust. You can reflect on the fact that from our observations of the universe, intelligent life is astonishingly rare, if not impossible outside of Earth, and as the bombs scream down around you, you can laugh at the fact that we dodged gamma-ray bursts, asteroid impacts, and all matter of interstellar phenomenon to beat the odds, but couldn't survive each other. So stop worrying and learn to love the bomb. Everyone knows about World War II, but you don't know everything. Here are 50 insane facts about the largest war in human history. Number 50. The war before the war. In the 1930s, the world was still scarred by the brutal First World War, and few Western nations wanted any part of another future conflict. But they wouldn't have a choice because the future Axis powers were already brewing plans. Imperial Japan had been building its territory for a while, and its biggest move came in the Sino-Japanese War of 1937. This war between China and Japan went on until the end of World War II and raised many eyes around the world just about how ambitious Japan actually was. But it wasn't the only Axis power planning for wars. Number 49. PR offensive. Unlike Japan, Germany was in no state to think about another war in the 1930s. Not that it stopped them. The devastating economic fallout after their first loss in the First World War was used by the Nazis as a motivation. While Hitler was rolling out the PR offensive to the world with one hand, including hosting the Olympics, the Nazi leader was also arming up. The 1930s were a time of heavy investments in the military for the Nazis. So when they started their march against Europe, everyone was surprised by just how powerful they'd gotten. But the Nazis weren't originally called that. Number 48. Damn Nazos? By now, the term Nazi had become shorthand around the world for a force of pure evil. But when the party first started pitching their gospel of hate, they were simply called the National Socialist Parties. Nazis wasn't even their preferred nickname. They called themselves the Nazos. So where did the term Nazi come from? It was coined by journalist Konrad Haydn, who derived the nickname from a Bavarian word that was a synonym for stupid or simple-minded. Somehow, the Nazis didn't notice. But not everything about the Nazis was originally evil. Number 47. An appropriated symbol. As the Nazis waved it around Europe and plastered it on their war machines, the swastika became a symbol of evil. Everyone was horrified, including those for whom it had a very different meaning. Although it was usually aligned differently, the swastika began as an ancient religious symbol that got its name from the Sanskrit word for a hooked cross. It typically meant fertility and good fortune, and was found in ancient civilizations around the world from Greece to India. Many of those who used it in religious rites have since called for its removal due to painful associations with the Nazi regime. And as war grew closer, some interesting experiments began. Number 46. Unleash the Death Ray. Robert Watson Watt was a British engineer who was a pioneer in radio technology, and when word got around of a Nazi death ray being built, people went to him. Was it really possible to build a machine that could down airplanes using radio waves? Watson Watt looked into it and determined the answer was no. But his research wasn't all for nothing. In the late 1930s, Watson Watt's research led to quantum leaps in radar technology, which made it easier for British troops to identify German planes and U-boats. But another technique to avoid war didn't go so well. Number 45. Pinky promise? The governments of Europe were desperate to avoid war, so they made several concessions to Hitler. The most significant were territorial concessions out of Czechoslovakia, whose leadership was not even invited to the peace summit. Hitler promised to abide by the terms of the treaty up until the moment he didn't. The last straw was when he went ahead and invaded Poland, crossing the red line Britain had set. That was enough for Britain to declare war on September 3, 1939, starting World War II. But did Britain itself have a hand in it? Number 44. The scapegoat? For decades since, historians have debated the legacy of then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, whose name has become synonymous with surrender. His detractors say he gave away the store to Hitler for no benefit. His defenders say he was acting in good faith and everyone in Europe was taken aback by just how ruthless Hitler was. But the verdict then was swift. Chamberlain was ousted before the next general election by his party, and he was replaced as Prime Minister by Winston Churchill. But Hitler had been planning for war for a long time before that. Number 43. The Dark Pact. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin couldn't have been more different. One represented a fascist regime, and the other was the current leader of the communist revolutionaries who took over Russia. But they had one thing in common: a dislike for the democracies of Western Europe. In the months before Hitler's invasion of Poland, the two countries signed a non-aggression pact that detailed how they would divvy up Eastern Europe. But like most things with Hitler, it couldn't be trusted for long. But for the time being, the war wasn't much of a war. Number 42. Overwhelmed. Poland fought hard at the start of the war, but they were fighting two much larger, better-equipped nations that were determined to overrun them. In September and October of 1939 alone, as the invasion began, Poland saw its forces devastated. Not only were 70,000 soldiers killed and more than 500,000 taken captive, but the fight against the Russians on the other front was just as bad. The Poles lost 50,000 men on their eastern front, while the Russians lost less than 1,000. But surprisingly, not everyone was united in how to respond. Number 41. War or not? Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, but the front was far away and the early moves of Britain were less than inspiring. The Royal Air Force mostly dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany in what would be known as the Phony War. Both in Britain and America, which was not involved in the war yet, there were many people who wanted no part of another war and advocated for isolationism. But it wasn't always wins for Germany and its allies right away. Number 40. Defeat in the North. Russia was looking to expand its territory, and it wasn't long before they launched an invasion into the neighboring country of Finland. This would have given Russia a beachhead in Scandinavia and a massive strategic advantage. But the Finns had another idea. Their well-trained army knew the snowy region and had some of the best snipers in the world. It wasn't long before the Soviets were on the run. This invasion also led to their expulsion from the League of Nations. However, Soviets' persistence would eventually lead Finland to signing a peace settlement. But the biggest front yet in World War II was about to launch. Number 39. Mon Dieu! Hitler's march across Europe concerned his neighbors, but many of them thought that he would eventually be satisfied. Then in 1940 came a line that no one could ignore: the invasion of France as Hitler crossed the Maginot Line. German forces advanced into France through Luxembourg and Belgium, overwhelming the French troops and leading to mass evacuations. It was the biggest German advance of the war yet, as the Nazi troops used armored vehicles and planes to gain territory in a hurry. It led to one of the biggest refugee crises in history. Number 38. Chaos at Dunkirk. With the German troops advancing fast and many British soldiers stationed in the north of France, Allied command decided they had to evacuate and fast. There weren't enough boats and the army capabilities were limited, especially with the German troops having trapped troops on the mainland. The evacuation effort would eventually be known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, because over 8 days, over 300,000 troops would be evacuated on a fleet of over 800 vessels, many of them civilian ships. But the crisis was only beginning. Number 37. The Flood. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were all invaded in 1940 and all fell quickly, which led to a massive influx of refugees fleeing Nazi tyranny. Over 8 million civilians fled their home countries, seeking new homes in Allied or neutral nations, but many wound up in displaced person camps and struggled to survive. While conditions weren't easy and overcrowding was a problem in many places, especially with the countries on war footing, some refugees were eager to enlist and turn the tables on the Nazis. And as the Nazis marched across Europe, things on the home front weren't any better. Number 36. Holy War. Hitler was a narcissist, and the Nazi dictator wanted to be praised everywhere. Something that raised his ire was the fact that the Roman Catholic schools in Germany didn't have his picture on the wall. Who was this Jesus guy that they kept everywhere instead? Hitler's persecution of Catholics intensified in Germany, and eventually he turned his eye to the man in charge, Pope Pius XII, who in the latter days of the war had issued condemnations of Hitler. Hitler consulted with a general about occupying Vatican City and killing the Pope, but the general was so shocked he tipped off the Italians instead. There were few institutions the Germans weren't trying to destabilize. Number 35. Money, money, money. Hitler had an interest in weakening Britain's economy to make it harder for them to fight in the war. In 1939, he came up with a scheme to cause hyperinflation in his hated enemy with an unlikely weapon: counterfeit cash. He enlisted prisoners at a German concentration camp and put them to work creating countless fake bills of the British pound. A whopping $132 million worth in that day's money, over $6 billion today. When introduced into the British economy, it caused brief fluctuations, but not the total chaos he hoped for. But not all of Hitler's schemes seemed to work out for him. Number 34. Shocking. Simply shocking. Hitler was obsessed with the purity of German culture and cracked down on any expression he deemed degenerate. Books were burned en masse, and creators of art thought unpatriotic were arrested. Connoisseurs of the arts were displeased, so Hitler decided to shock everyone by holding an exhibition of banned art called Degenerate Art. A massive collection of over 650 books, paintings, and sculptures were put on display, and the public came en masse to stare, far more than the number of people who visited approved Nazi art galleries. It wasn't the only time Hitler embarrassed himself. Number 33. The perfect baby? Hitler was also fixated on the purity of the German race, plastering propaganda posters with images of blonde, blue-eyed children, which was ironic given that he was a dark-haired Austrian, but no one was going to tell him that. He even started a campaign in 1935 to find the perfect Aryan baby as a symbol of the country. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was put in charge of the search, and oddly chose a brunette child whose photo was submitted to him by Hans Bahlen, a prominent photographer. Bahlen was an anti-Nazi activist who had submitted the photo of a Jewish child as a way to sabotage the Nazi campaign. It worked a little too well, as the girl's family had to flee to Latvia. Art had a powerful impact on those campaigning against the Nazis. Number 32. The Great Dictator. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the thought of getting involved in World War II wasn't very popular. The United States had a strong isolationist bent, and many people campaigned against the intervention. The news media wasn't covering many of Hitler's atrocities, and those trying to raise attention didn't have much luck. But there was one exception: the legendary silent film star Charlie Chaplin. The anti-Nazi activist had no luck getting studios to fund his anti-Nazi satire, The Great Dictator, so he funded it himself at great cost. Hitler was reportedly not pleased to be portrayed as a buffoon. But a far bigger name was working the other side. Number 31. The Pilot. While the America First movement had a troubled past, with many of its members coming from groups that were initially loyal to Nazi Germany, the isolationists found hope in a celebrity champion, Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot who was one of the country's most famous German Americans. Many people even tried to convince him to run against President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940, with polls showing that he was the Republicans' best candidate. He eventually decided against a run. A celebrity with no political experience deciding to run for president? Crazy talk! The war was about to intensify and bring in new fronts. Number 30. Take to the skies. After the fall of France, Nazi Germany turned their attention toward Britain. A ground invasion would have been challenging against the fortified island nation, so Hitler focused on bombarding the British into surrender. But that turned out to be more difficult than expected thanks to the Dowding system. Crafted by RAF Commander-in-Chief Hugh Dowding, it set up a reporting system that let the British respond to air attacks faster. This would streamline the process of passing information between the ground and the air and foiled many Nazi attacks, but it couldn't foil all of them. Number 29. On the Run. As the Blitz hit London and other English cities, everyone had a role to play to ensure their survival. Many of the men went off to war, while women were left to take on many of their old responsibilities. As for the children, many parents didn't want them anywhere near the city. One stray bomb could wipe out an entire family, so parents frequently sent their children to live in the countryside for the duration of the bombing, with relatives if they had them, or a willing host family if they could find them. This was famously the setup for the C.S. Lewis novel The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But Britain looked like a heavy underdog at first. Number 28. Outmatched. Britain had never fought an extensive air war before, and its initial fleet wasn't the most impressive in the world. They had around 3,700 planes in the RAF to start, with less than half of them being high-speed fighter aircraft. By comparison, the Luftwaffe had almost 4,200 total aircraft, including over 1,000 fighter planes and almost 1,000 bombers. This allowed them to hit Great Britain more frequently, hoping to pound them into submission. The reality, though, was rather different. Number 27. The Victor. While the island nation suffered heavy losses, including a single brutal day when they lost 39 aircraft and 14 pilots, Britain's defense systems were far more accurate than Germany's attacks. Ultimately, they survived the attack and persisted, while Germany suffered far heavier losses in the Battle of Britain. While the British lost over 1,500 aircraft and over 500 air crew, plus over 1,000 other casualties, the Axis forces lost hundreds more planes and suffered over 3,000 dead. And the war was about to change again. Number 26. New fronts. It was the middle of 1941, and the German bombing of Britain had failed to cause the nation's surrender. So naturally, the perfect thing for Hitler to do was open up a huge and brutal new front on the war. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union in what would be known as Operation Barbarossa. Why did Hitler decide to take this risk? What many consider to be the biggest blunder of the war. It was all about his obsession with race. Russia had a lot of land, and Hitler thought it'd be great real estate to fill with German citizens instead of those supposedly inferior Russians. And it wasn't the only time Hitler picked a fight he didn't need to. Number 25. A costly declaration. It was the most famous moment of the war, a day of infamy. The Japanese forces, looking to deter the United States from interfering in the conquests in the Pacific, had attacked Pearl Harbor and devastated the United States naval fleet. The U.S. immediately declared war on Japan in retaliation, and those advocating against war switched their strategy to urging the U.S. to stay out of the European front. But they wouldn't have that chance because almost immediately, Germany declared war on the United States in solidarity with its ally Japan. And just like that, Hitler had made himself another enemy that would arrive on the European battlefield. U.S. soldiers were on their way, but fighting wasn't the only way to die in such a conflict. Number 24. The first casualty. Who was the first U.S. soldier to die in World War II? Surprisingly, it wasn't in combat. His name was Robert N. Losey, an Iowa native who worked as an aeronautical meteorologist. He was serving as a military attaché in 1940 during the German invasion of Norway. While working to evacuate American diplomats from the country, he was caught up in a bombing raid, becoming the first American soldier to die on the European front, over a year and a half before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. One unit of soldiers wore uniforms that would cause a double take. Number 23. Wrong uniform. The 45th Infantry Division was as American as they came, containing soldiers from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. Those areas all had a large Native American population, which influenced the unit's choice of uniform. They all wore a pin that contained a proud eagle, atop a swastika. The Nazi symbol was a commonly used symbol of good luck among Native American groups, and no one raised an eyebrow until the 1930s. But there wouldn't be any unfortunate cases of mistaken identity when the unit was deployed. By 1939, they'd replaced the symbol with the Native American Thunderbird. It wasn't the only pre-war symbol that changed. Number 22. Hitler loves America? Being the dictator of an empire comes with some advantages, especially when you determine what's essential war spending. Hitler had secret fortresses and compounds built for himself, but he also traveled in style, on his own private train. It was basically a mobile compound with a conference room, a bedroom, and a dining room, and its initial name, America. Needless to say, that became awkward by the time the American forces were the ones targeting the train, and the name was eventually changed to Brandenburg in 1943. Some changes might seem less essential. Number 21. No hamburgers here. America's a melting pot with multiple generations of immigrants influencing its culture and its language. And as the country went to war with Germany, people were surprised to realize just how many common words had German roots. Probably the most common example, the good old-fashioned hamburger, which got a name change to Liberty Steak in many locations. Of course, it was the same dish, which made it a little pointless. Freedom fries to go with your Liberty Steak. Food and drink could be oddly important to the war effort. Number 20. Gotta have my Coke. During the war, U.S. manufacturing operations focused on essentials. They made sure the troops had ammo, armor, supplies, and soda? The Coca-Cola Company's signature drink was beloved by troops, and the company showed its support for the boys in uniform by setting up manufacturing plants in North Africa. This allowed them to ship millions of bottles of Coke across the Mediterranean to the soldiers, and helped to improve the company's image and cemented the brand as a household name for years to come. But the tide of the battle was turning, and it was getting bloody. Number 19. The worst battle. Hitler had made a critical misjudgment when he invaded Russia. Napoleon could have told him that you never invade Russia. But neither side was prepared for just how brutal that front would be. The German forces were superior and were able to inflict massive casualties on the Russians, with the country suffering a shocking 21 million casualties by the end of the war. But they were fighting on their own turf, had superior numbers, and inflicted massive pain on the Germans, with 80% of German casualties in the war coming from the Eastern Front. And as the war turned against him, Hitler became increasingly paranoid. Number 18. Death in the ranks. Hitler was surrounded by powerful people who advised him on the war effort, but he didn't like the advice he was hearing. It was very common for him to turn on people who questioned him and cast them out of the party, with even elite Nazi officials like Werner von Braun finding themselves on outs in the last days of the war. Most famously, he executed a shocking 84 of his generals over the course of the war, although most of them were actually plotting against him. And can you blame them? Most famously, Hitler was nearly killed by his own men. Number 17. Operation Valkyrie. In the last year of the war, Hitler was becoming increasingly erratic, and many of his military inner circle believed that he was actively sabotaging the war effort. For one thing, he kept on killing his own scientists. Led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, a group of Nazi insiders planned to kill Hitler with a bomb plot at his secret compound. But a sudden change in seating arrangements led to the bomb only injuring Hitler, and most of the collaborators being executed. Even his renowned general Erwin Rommel was caught up in it, bringing a sudden end to his military career. Some of Hitler's plans were just genuinely bizarre. Number 16. Bugging England. In the early days of the war, the Nazis were considering unconventional attacks on their enemy, and one tactic was smaller than usual, with more legs. The Nazis looked at weaponizing the Colorado potato beetle, a notorious pest of potato crops. They would drop a mass number of the bugs on British farmland, devastating their food supplies and starving the island nation into surrender. But the plan was ultimately dropped for one reason. It wasn't feasible to collect the 40 million bugs needed for the mission. But there were some lines even Hitler wouldn't cross. Number 15. Even evil has standards. The Nazi scientists were hard at work on deadly biological weapons, including enhanced versions of typhoid and cholera. However, when they presented them to the Nazi leader, he didn't approve, and most of the projects never saw the light of day. What offended him about these plans? Hitler had no problems killing millions of civilians, but he was also a World War I veteran, and that war had a brutal biological and chemical warfare component. Maybe it hit a little too close to home, but far more powerful weapons were in development. Number 14. The Nazi A-bomb? It was one of the most persistent rumors after the war. Did the United States just barely beat the Nazis to the atom bomb? The answer is, not really. The Nazis weren't close to finishing a nuclear weapon, but that didn't mean that they didn't make progress on weapons of mass destruction. The Nazis had uranium, and the Japanese could get closer to the US mainland, so the plan was to hit the West Coast with a conventional bomb packed with uranium. But the plan never came to fruition, and the German uranium may have eventually wound up in US hands. But across the ocean on the US mainland, development was heating up. Number 13. The Canadian bomb? Canada was ahead of the US in the war in a lot of ways, entering the Allied powers while the US was still neutral. They even had their own atom bomb project with Britain called the Tuba Laos Project. It would eventually merge with the United States Manhattan Project to speed up development, with both sides promising to share their information. But the US didn't live up to its end of the deal, and would be another 7 years before Britain successfully developed their own bomb. And ultimately, the first bomb detonated wasn't in combat. Number 12. It's a go. The hope was that the nuclear bomb would lead to the end of the war by delivering a massive punch to the Axis powers. It took a lot of money and manpower to build the bomb, and the Allies wanted to be sure that it would work before dropping it. The first successful test actually took place on US soil at a testing range in the New Mexico desert. It was a massive success, and it horrified one of the men responsible for it, as Oppenheimer quoted a line from a Hindu sacred text, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." But there was a twist to the first two bombs dropped. Number 11. Alike, but different. The first two nuclear bombs detonated in combat, and the only ones so far, were nicknamed Fat Man and Little Boy. But their size and designations weren't the only differences between the two bombs. They actually used entirely different mechanisms, with Little Boy being powered by the fission of uranium-235, while Fat Man, which was 40% more powerful, used plutonium. Now let's get to some truly shocking facts about the war. Number 10. The good Hitler? William Patrick Stewart Houston was by all accounts a normal British lad growing up in Liverpool. He would eventually immigrate to the United States and serve in the US Navy, but he had a little secret. His father's name was Aloy Hitler Jr., Hitler's half-brother. Not only would he fight for the United States against his mad uncle's empire, but he would be awarded the Purple Heart after being wounded in combat. Just another noble German-American doing his part against the Axis powers. The Nazis used all sorts of unusual tactics to fund the war effort. Number 9. Who is Max Heiliger? The main purpose behind the Nazi persecution of the Jewish people was Hitler's obsession with race science, but the Nazis weren't above benefiting from it. They looted money, gold, and jewelry from the Jews they arrested and deported. But because many countries were freezing the Nazis out of their banking systems, the SS created a bank account under the name of Max Heiliger, which would allow them to transfer assets undetected. But in some ways, the threat of the Nazi death machine outlasted the Nazis. Number 8. Unholy ground. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was a brutal and deadly place where countless people died. It wasn't an extermination camp like some, but the rampant spread of disease and lack of medical care led to many casualties, including Anne Frank. When the camp was liberated in 1945, the plague typhus was so widespread that the Allies decided to burn the place to the ground to contain the spread. But amid the horror, there were heroes. Number 7. The Saviors. Most countries that were invaded by the Nazis quickly saw their Jewish community rounded up and deported or killed, but not Denmark. Denmark had quickly surrendered to the Nazis and allowed themselves to be occupied, and the lack of resistance meant the Nazis gave them more autonomy. That gave them several years before the Nazis began cracking down, and the Danes were able to smuggle the vast majority of their Jewish population to neutral Sweden. But sometimes, all it takes is one good man. Number 6. The heroism of Sergeant Edmunds. The Nazis were notorious for violating the laws governing prisoners of war, especially when it came to Jewish soldiers. When they captured American troops, they would demand the Jews among them be singled out so they could be taken to concentration camps or killed. But they hadn't met Master Sergeant Roderick Edmunds. When the army man was ordered to identify the Jews amongst the captured POWs, he boldly said that they were all Jews. While this put the entire unit at risk, the Nazis were scared off by the threat of being persecuted for war crimes. Edmunds may have saved as many as 300 people and was eventually honored as one of Israel's righteous among the nations. Some facts of the war are hard to believe. Number 5. The Old College Try. If any Bostonians were fighting the Nazis and saw them on the march, they might get an odd sense of déjà vu. Why does the Nazi Sieg Heil March song sound almost exactly like the Harvard Fight song? That's because the composer actually attended Harvard University, and amid the Nazis' many crimes, a little plagiarism probably wasn't high on anyone's list. And for some, the war went on and on. Number 4. The peace that wasn't. If the war hadn't ended when it did due to the collapse of Nazi Germany and the strikes on Japan, it's likely there would have been a new front as the Soviet Union invaded Japan. While this war never reached its scale that it could have, the two countries were still at war and still technically are. A formal peace treaty was never signed between the two of them, and negotiations fell apart in 2000 over some islands that Russia had seized. But even amid the carnage, there was some hope. Number 3. In the blood. While World War II was the most bloody war in human history, it did have a high number of soldiers who actually came home after surviving serious injuries. What set this war apart? It was the advance in medical technology in one technique in particular. Blood transfusions had been around for a long time, but they were consistently used in combat for the first time in this war, and it saved many lives. And in the fog of war, things got weird. Number 2. The parachuting Nazi. The year was 1941, and Germany was still confident about victory. So confident, in fact, that they sent one of their top men to the UK to negotiate Britain's surrender. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, parachuted into Scotland intending to return a hero, and instead was promptly arrested. He was kept as a prisoner of war for the rest of the war until he was sent to Nuremberg to answer for his crimes, where he received a life sentence. But the heroes of World War II included some surprising names. Number 1. The Big Guns. Is this a list of soldiers or a marquee? World War II had a massive draft, and many of Hollywood's most famous names wound up strapping on their army greens. Among the people who would later become famous or took a break from the movies included Walter Matthau, Peter Fonda, David Niven, and Christopher Lee. One name surprisingly absent: All-American cowboy John Wayne, who was excused due to a football injury. If you're looking for more secrets to the last days of the war, check out what actually happened to Nazi leaders after World War II, or watch this video instead.